Good evening and welcome back to the channel where we take something enormous and slightly terrifying and turn it into a bedtime story. Tonight we're unpacking an institution older than writing, older than most religions, and somehow still capable of ruining Thanksgiving dinner. We're talking about marriage, not the version with a photographer, a string quartet, and a seating chart nobody agreed on, but the original edition. The one involving livestock, legal tablets, and the quiet understanding that your heart's opinion was not on the guest list. Before we drift into it, if you're the sort of person who enjoys a slow, factual wander through the strange corners of history, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it tells the algorithm that boring is, in fact, beautiful. And if tonight's episode happens to be the one that finally puts you to sleep, that's not a bug, that's the entire business model. Now settle in. Turn the lights down to whatever setting your eyes consider acceptable but not committed. Let your shoulders drop an inch, and ask yourself something you've probably never actually asked yourself. Why do we get married at all? Not the Pinterest version, not the diamond commercial version. The actual, load-bearing reason humans invented a lifelong legal bond between two people. Was it ever about love? Did anyone, anywhere, actually choose their spouse the way you choose a Netflix show? Or is romance just clever branding slapped onto a much older, much colder arrangement? Let's find out. And to do that, we have to go back past your grandparents, past your country, past the very idea of a country, to a time when marriage wasn't a ceremony at all. It was barely even a concept. It was just two exhausted people and a fire. Part 1, before the word marriage even existed. Strip away every ring, every vow, every wedding cake you've ever seen, and go back to the very first human communities. Here, marriage as an institution simply didn't exist yet. What existed instead was something more like a truce, two people agreeing without paperwork or ceremony to share warmth, food, and the considerable workload of not dying. There was no proposal. There was no getting down on one knee unless you were kneeling to skin something for dinner. Partnership wasn't sentimental, it was structural. Picture it. You belong to a small band, maybe a few dozen people, most of them related to you in ways a modern genealogist would need a very large whiteboard to sort out. There is no privacy in the way you understand it. There is no property to speak of, and certainly no honeymoon unless sleeping a little further from the fire counts as a romantic getaway. Your survival is entirely tied to the group around you, and choosing a partner has nothing to do with butterflies. It has everything to do with reliability. Can this person carry their share? Will they stay when the weather turns bad? Are they, crucially, unlikely to wander off with the only good spear in camp? Children sat quietly at the center of all of it. In a world where one poor harvest season or one bad winter could gut half a community, raising the next generation successfully was the single most important task anyone had. Nobody wrote laws about it, but patterns still emerged. People paired off. Groups exchanged members with neighboring bands, partly to keep the peace and partly to avoid the extremely awkward genetic consequences of everyone marrying their own cousins generation after generation. Expectations formed, not through courts, but through something far more effective. The fact that in a group that small, everyone always knew your business. Was any of this romantic by our standards? Almost certainly not. There were no candlelit dinners because dinner was whatever hadn't managed to escape fast enough, and candles were tens of thousands of years away from being anyone's concern. Affection, though real affection, surely existed. Humans have always been humans, and there's no reason to think prehistoric people were incapable of genuinely caring for one another. But that affection was a bonus feature, not the core function. The core function was blunt and practical. Can the two of us survive longer together than we could apart? It's a strange thing to sit with. Every over-engineered wedding toast, every syrupy anniversary card, every modern couple bickering about whose turn it is to do the dishes. All of it traces back, in some roundabout way, to two prehistoric people deciding it was more efficient to share a shelter than to freeze alone with their principles intact. Romance, as we know it, is a later upgrade, bolted on once the immediate threat of starvation eased up enough to leave room for feelings. So no, there was no institution of marriage yet. There was something quieter and stranger, the simple, practical realization that life was less brutal when faced with a partner. Everything else, the contracts, the ceremonies, the dowries, the family drama, would be layered on top of this over the following few thousand years, like an increasingly ornate cake balanced on a very plain, very sensible piece of bread. But humans, being humans, were never going to leave something that simple alone for long. The moment we started accumulating things worth fighting over, somebody was inevitably going to want it written down, witnessed, and stamped. And for that shift, we travel to a hot, dusty stretch of land between two rivers, where marriage received its very first taste of bureaucracy. Part 2. Mesopotamia and the invention of the marriage contract. Let's be clear from the start. The people who first turned marriage into a legal document were not poets. They were administrators. In ancient Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years ago, the famous legal code associated with the Babylonian king Hammurabi laid out marriage in blunt, businesslike terms. What a bride was owed, what happened when a husband misbehaved, and what the wider community could expect if a household fell apart. Marriage here wasn't something you felt. It was something you filed. Imagine your surroundings. You live in a densely packed city of sun-baked mudbrick, the air thick with heat, irrigation canals threading through the streets, temples looming over everything. Your marriage doesn't begin with a question directed at you. It begins with a negotiation, conducted almost entirely by your parents, while you stand nearby feeling less like a bride or groom and more like a particularly promising plot of farmland under discussion. Terms get hashed out. Payments get agreed upon. And then, crucially, someone writes it all down. Because in this world, an unrecorded marriage barely counted as a marriage at all. That written record was the marriage. Without it, you were simply two people living under the same roof with no legal standing whatsoever, a situation regarded as socially messy and legally risky. So a scribe was brought in. And with the seriousness of a modern lawyer billing by the hour, pressed wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay. The resulting tablet recorded the bride's dowry, the groom's responsibilities, and this is the part that really tells you everything, the specific penalties if either party stepped out of line. It functioned simultaneously as a marriage license, a prenuptial agreement, and a warning label, all fired into a single small brick of clay. And the penalties were nothing if not specific. The legal codes of the time didn't traffic in vague sentiment. They dealt in outcomes. What happens if a wife is neglected? What happens if a husband takes an additional wife? What happens if a marriage produces no children? What happens if someone is unfaithful? Compensation was spelled out, sometimes with a level of detail that would make a modern insurance adjuster weep with professional admiration. Some of these provisions offered women more protection than you might expect: rights to property, guarantees of support if a marriage dissolved. Others were harsh in ways that would horrify us today. But the underlying principle was consistent. Marriage here was a matter of enforceable law, not private feeling. Try to imagine how strange this would feel from the inside. In much of the modern world, the marriage license is an afterthought, a small bit of paperwork squeezed in between the ceremony and the reception. In ancient Mesopotamia, the contract essentially was the ceremony. Getting the wording exactly right mattered more than any speech or toast, because a poorly drafted agreement could damage two families for a generation. It's the equivalent of your mortgage paperwork also being your wedding vows. And given how many modern marriages eventually squabble over money, our ancestors may genuinely have been onto something by combining the two documents from the start. There were even provisions for what we might loosely call trial arrangements, and remarriage after a death or divorce was handled with the same meticulous bookkeeping as everything else. Every situation seemed to have a corresponding clause. Every clause had a price attached. So if you've ever felt that modern weddings have become a little too transactional, Take some comfort from the fact that 4,000 years ago, your ancestors were quite literally engraving a bride's value into permanent stone tablets, complete with the personal seals of witnesses. Marriage then began its long career as a formal legal institution in these sun-scorched cities between two rivers, one carefully worded clay tablet at a time. But Mesopotamia wasn't unique in treating a spouse as something with a calculable value. Underneath every one of these contracts sat a single stubborn question that would echo across the ancient world for millennia. Exactly how much was a husband or a wife actually worth? To answer that, we need to talk about the price tag. Part 3. The bride price. Love, but make it an invoice. In much of the ancient world, love arrived with paperwork attached, and often with an actual bill. The bride price was precisely what it sounds like, a payment made by the groom's family to the bride's family, typically in livestock, silver, grain, or whatever form of wealth a household could reasonably gather. Officially, this was never described as buying a person. It was framed as compensation, as a gesture of seriousness, as proof that the groom's family could genuinely support a new household. Think of it as the ancestor of the modern engagement ring, except instead of a diamond, it might be a dozen goats and a solemn promise not to embarrass anyone at the feast. The underlying logic, however grim, made a certain amount of sense within its own context. When a daughter married and left her household, her family lost a working member, someone who hauled water, ground grain, wove cloth, tended animals, and generally kept the domestic machinery running. The bride price offset that loss. It also served as a kind of financial background check. If a family couldn't spare a handful of animals or a portion of silver, how exactly were they going to support a wife, and soon enough, children? What counted as currency varied enormously depending on time and place. In some regions it was cattle, the ancient equivalent of a stable, respectable investment portfolio, only with legs. In others it was silver, cloth, tools, or grain. Among wealthier families, the sums involved could be genuinely staggering, functioning as much as a public display of status as an actual payment. Among poorer families, the amount might be modest, negotiated down over the course of several tense conversations, sometimes paid gradually over time, a very early, very awkward version of a payment plan. And the negotiations themselves were often the real event. Two families would sit across from one another, each pretending to be entirely reasonable while quietly calculating exactly how much could be extracted from the other side. The bride's family would emphasize her virtues, her health, her work ethic, the good standing of her lineage. The groom's family would nod along politely while attempting to talk the number down without triggering a lasting grudge. It was part wedding planning, part hostage negotiation, and the two people actually getting married typically had about as much input into the proceedings as the furniture being discussed in the next room. Before feeling too smug about how far we've supposedly come, it's worth noting that this instinct never fully disappeared. The modern engagement ring, the expectation of a dramatic and expensive proposal, the unspoken pressure for one partner to demonstrate financial seriousness before a wedding, these are all distant, glittering descendants of the bride price. We've simply rebranded it, wrapped it in rose petals, and insisted it was purely about sentiment. Somewhere, an ancient father counting out livestock is nodding along knowingly. The bride price also functioned as a kind of insurance policy. In some societies, if a husband later mistreated or abandoned his wife, the original payment could be forfeited, or other financial complications could arise, giving the bride's family a genuine stake in how she was treated going forward. It wasn't a guarantee of a happy marriage by any means, but it did mean the groom had something tangible at risk. Walking away from the arrangement meant walking away from real wealth, and few people did that lightly. Of course, the system had its darker edges too. A sufficiently high bride price could effectively price young men out of marriage altogether, forcing them to spend years accumulating enough wealth while their prospects and their intendeds quietly aged in the meantime. Ambitious families used the system to climb socially. Desperate families used it simply to get by. And underneath all of it sat the uncomfortable premise that a person's worth could be measured out in livestock, grain, and silver, priced against whatever the going rate happened to be that season. But here's the twist that tends to surprise people. The money didn't always flow in that direction. Across huge stretches of the ancient and medieval world, the payment ran exactly the other way, and that single reversal changed the entire calculus of marriage. Part 4, the dowry, when the money flows the other way. Now flip the arrangement entirely. In plenty of societies, it was the bride's family who paid, sending their daughter into her new household accompanied by land, coin, linens, furniture, or livestock. This was part gift, part safety net, part strategic investment, and occasionally, if we're honest, part incentive to make sure somebody actually wanted to marry her. A generous dowry could transform an ordinary young woman into the most sought-after match in the region overnight. A meager one could leave a perfectly lovely daughter waiting at home for standards to quietly lower themselves. At first glance, this seems backward. Why would a bride's family pay to give her away? But the logic, once you sit with it, is just as coldly practical as everything else we've covered tonight. In societies where a wife was viewed primarily as a dependent rather than a laborer, the groom's household was effectively taking on an additional mouth to feed. The dowry offset that cost. It represented the bride's own contribution to the new household, her financial stake in the marriage, and a way of ensuring she didn't arrive with nothing and no leverage of her own. Among wealthy families, a dowry could be enormous: land, servants, furniture, jewelry, entire chests of fine linen, and sums of money substantial enough to make or seriously strain the groom's fortunes. A daughter with a spectacular dowry could marry well above her family's usual station, her relatives effectively purchasing entry into a better bloodline. It was social climbing with an attached price list, and everyone involved understood exactly what game was being played, even while smiling politely and discussing love. Here's a detail worth pausing on. In many places, the dowry technically remained the woman's own property, at least in theory. It was meant to support her, to be returned to her if the marriage dissolved, or to provide for her if she was widowed. In a world with no pensions, no formal safety nets, and very little institutional sympathy for a woman left with nothing, the dowry functioned as her own private insurance policy, woven into the marriage from its very first day. Whether a husband actually respected that boundary in practice was, naturally, an entirely separate matter. The darker side of the dowry system is one that still echoes uncomfortably today. In societies where securing a respectable marriage required a substantial dowry, having several daughters could become a genuine financial catastrophe for a family. Households scrambled and sometimes ruined themselves trying to marry off multiple girls respectably. This created real, lasting pressure, and in far too many times and places, real cruelty, as daughters were treated less like people and more like expensive obligations to be resolved. And the negotiations, once again, were a spectacle in their own right. Two families haggling over precisely how large a dowry should be, how and when it would be paid, what would happen to it if the marriage failed, who would retain custody of it afterward. Matchmakers and go-betweens shuttled offers back and forth like diplomats. Reputations rose and fell over dowry disputes. A promised dowry that failed to materialize on schedule could shatter an entire alliance and ignite a feud that outlasted the marriage itself, sometimes outlasting both spouses. If any of this is starting to sound less like romance and more like a corporate merger negotiated by very tense lawyers, you've understood the ancient world perfectly. For the overwhelming majority of human history, marriage functioned as a transfer of wealth wrapped loosely in ceremony, and whichever direction the money happened to flow, it moved reliably and predictably every single time. Love was, at best, optional. Assets were not. But not every ancient civilization ran on such rigid arithmetic. Because a little further south, along a particular famous river, marriage was handled with a casualness that would have deeply offended the meticulous accountants of Mesopotamia. Part 5, Egypt, where marriage was surprisingly laid back. Drift down the Nile now, because ancient Egypt handled marriage with a casualness that would have scandalized the clay tablet bureaucrats of Mesopotamia. There was often no grand ceremony required, no religious ritual, no scribe hovering with a stylus. A couple simply decided to move in together and build a life, and that decision alone constituted a marriage. You were married because you behaved as though you were married. No temple blessing needed. No priest clearing his throat over the proceedings. Egyptian women held a legal standing that would have been almost unthinkable elsewhere in the ancient world. They could own property outright, buy and sell land, run businesses, inherit wealth, and remarkably initiate divorce on their own terms. This wasn't a marginal exception buried in obscure texts. It was a genuinely functional part of everyday life. For the standards of the ancient world, this was practically radical. Consider the relief of it. No scribe assessing your worth in silver. No temple ceremony demanding your attendance. No priest presiding over your union like a landlord inspecting a lease. In Egypt, marriage was fundamentally a private matter between two people and their families. When a couple set up a shared household with the clear intention of staying together, that act of cohabitation was the wedding. It's the ancient equivalent of a couple simply deciding things had become serious, minus the arguments over whose furniture makes the cut. That said, Egyptians were nothing if not practical, and they frequently drew up written agreements anyway, not to make the marriage official, since it didn't need official sanction, but to protect property and clarify expectations in case things eventually fell apart. These documents laid out exactly what each partner brought into the household, what a wife was entitled to keep, and how property would be divided if the marriage ended. Less sacred vow, more sensible financial planning, which, given how many modern marriages still end in disputes over furniture and bank accounts, feels almost enviably wise. And here's the part that tends to genuinely surprise people. Egyptian wives held a level of independence that would have astonished the Greeks and Romans who came later. A married woman could own land under her own name. She could buy and sell property freely, operate a business, inherit family wealth, and take a husband to court if the situation demanded it. If she wanted out of a marriage, she could simply leave, and she typically kept her own property when she did. In a world where women elsewhere were frequently treated as legal nonentities, Egyptian wives functioned as something remarkably close to full legal participants in their own lives. Divorce itself followed the same uncomplicated pattern. If a couple no longer wished to remain married, they simply stopped being married. There was no religious barrier standing in the way, no drawn-out annulment process, no lifelong sentence disguised as devotion. Property was divided according to whatever prior agreement existed. The wife retained what belonged to her, and both parties were generally free to remarry. It was, in a sense, startlingly modern. A version of no-fault separation that the rest of the world wouldn't stumble back toward for thousands of years. None of this means Egyptian marriage was some kind of romantic utopia. Matches were still frequently arranged with family interests firmly in mind, and children were still expected to carry on the family name and eventually support their aging parents. Love poetry does survive from this era, and some of it is genuinely tender, suggesting real affection certainly existed between many couples. But affection remained a welcome bonus rather than the entire foundation of the institution. What set Egypt apart wasn't the presence of love. It was the flexibility and comparative fairness of the underlying structure. Sit with the contrast for a moment. In Mesopotamia, marriage was a legal fortress built from clay and clauses. In Egypt, it was closer to a handshake and a shared roof, with a written receipt available on request if either party wanted one. Same ancient world, wildly different philosophies, and both entirely convinced they'd figured out the correct approach. Now brace yourself, because crossing the sea into ancient Greece, the temperature drops considerably. Part 6. Ancient Greece Duty Without Warmth. In Greece, and especially in a city like Athens, marriage was less a partnership and more a civic responsibility carried out with grim seriousness. A man married to produce legitimate heirs and to keep a functioning household running, not, generally speaking, to enjoy anyone's company. Brides were frequently still teenagers, transferred from a father's authority to a husband's with barely a pause in between. Wives were expected to remain inside the home, manage domestic affairs, and stay largely invisible to the outside world. Whatever romance existed in a Greek man's life tended to happen everywhere except inside the marriage itself. The age gap alone is worth sitting with, because it's genuinely striking. A respectable Athenian man often didn't marry until his late 20s or early 30s, once he'd established himself and completed his civic obligations. His bride, by contrast, might be as young as 14 or 15, moving almost directly from her father's household into her husband's, with little opportunity along the way to develop opinions of her own. This wasn't a meeting of equals. It was an established adult acquiring a very young wife, whose primary function was bearing legitimate children and running an efficient household. And that household was quite literally her entire world. A respectable Athenian wife was expected to remain indoors, overseeing servants, weaving cloth, managing supplies, and staying almost entirely out of public view. Being seen too often outside the home, or becoming a subject of public conversation at all, was considered improper. The ideal wife, by Athenian standards, was one whose name was rarely spoken by men outside her own household, for good reasons or bad. Imagine a marriage where your crowning achievement was being so thoroughly unremarkable in public life that virtually nobody beyond your own walls knew you existed. The wedding itself wasn't entirely without ceremony. There were processions, ritual sacrifices, a feast, and symbolic gestures marking the bride's transfer from one household to another. She arrived with a dowry, and the community formally witnessed the union. But strip away the ritual trappings and the core function remained unmistakable. Secure heirs, protect the bloodline, keep the domestic machinery running. Feelings were not part of the design brief, and nobody involved seemed to expect otherwise. Here's where the arrangement turns distinctly bleak. Because marriage wasn't expected to provide emotional or intellectual companionship, Greek men frequently sought those things elsewhere entirely, and this was broadly accepted by society at large. A wife managed the home and bore the children. Genuine conversation, deep friendship, and intellectual engagement often happened out in the wider world, among circles that pointedly excluded her. The marriage formed the foundation of the household, but it was rarely anywhere near the center of a man's emotional life. For the wife, this arrangement offered relatively little in return. She carried substantial responsibility with very little personal freedom, playing a role that earned scant public recognition, married to a man who regarded her more as essential infrastructure than as a genuine partner. Her value rested almost entirely on her respectability and her ability to produce legitimate sons. A wife who fulfilled her duties quietly and competently was praised in roughly the same tone you might use to praise a well-managed estate, approvingly, but with total detachment. Sparta, worth noting, ran things rather differently, granting women considerably more physical freedom and a stronger public presence, an arrangement the rest of Greece apparently found more than a little unsettling. But it's the Athenian model that dominates our historical picture of Greek marriage, and it's a genuinely chilly one. An institution engineered for order, inheritance, and household management, with anything resembling romance carefully filed under not applicable. If Greece treated marriage as a solemn civic duty, you might reasonably expect Rome to follow a similar script. Instead, the Romans, inventive as ever, took the entire institution and reshaped it into something layered with legal categories, fine print, and surprising flexibility. Part 7. Rome Marriage with an Instruction Manual. The Romans approached marriage with the same obsessive attention to detail they brought to everything else, and the result was an institution with genuine legal nuance. There were, broadly speaking, different forms of marriage, distinguished largely by how much legal authority a husband gained over his wife's person and property. In one older, more traditional form, a wife left her birth family's legal authority entirely and effectively became subject to her husband, almost as though she were his legal daughter rather than his equal partner. Her property became his property. Her separate legal identity dissolved into his household. But over time, a different and increasingly popular arrangement emerged, one in which the wife remained legally tied to her own father's family and kept her property entirely separate from her husband's. This second arrangement quietly rewrote the rules. A woman married this way could own property in her own name, inherit wealth independently, and maintain a level of financial autonomy that her Greek counterparts could scarcely have imagined. Her dowry was managed with the clear expectation that it would return to her if the marriage ended. She remained, throughout, a distinct legal person with her own distinct legal assets. For the ancient world, this was a remarkably sophisticated arrangement, and it produced a number of genuinely wealthy and politically influential Roman women. Roman marriage also rested on a concept that sounds almost sentimental until you examine its practical consequences. A marriage was considered to exist for as long as both parties intended it to exist, an ongoing agreement rather than a single binding event fixed at the wedding ceremony. This gave Roman marriage tremendous flexibility, but it also introduced a built-in instability, because if the mutual intention to remain married evaporated, the marriage could, in principle, simply end along with it. We'll return to exactly how casually the Romans handled that ending shortly, because they turned the process into something close to an art form. Weddings themselves ranged from lavish to nearly non-existent, depending on the family's means. Wealthy Romans staged elaborate ceremonies, auspicious dates chosen after consulting religious officials, a bride wearing a distinctive veil, a torchlit procession to her new household, accompanied by songs and a considerable amount of ribald joking from the crowd. Poorer Romans married with far less fanfare. But across every level of society, marriage was expected of respectable citizens. Producing legitimate children and contributing new citizens to the Republic, and later the Empire, was treated as a civic duty. Roman emperors even passed legislation encouraging marriage and penalizing those who remained stubbornly unmarried, an ancient nudge that delighted essentially nobody. Status governed everything. Who you were legally permitted to marry depended heavily on citizenship and social class. A properly recognized marriage between two citizens produced legitimate children with full inheritance rights. Unions that crossed certain legal boundaries weren't recognized in the same way, and children born from such pairings could find themselves excluded from the privileges of full legitimacy. Marriage, in other words, wasn't simply about two individuals. It was about correctly maintaining the entire social order, one properly documented citizen at a time. Roman marriage, then, was a genuine and respected institution, central to public life, while also proving more adaptable than almost anything that had come before it. Depending on the arrangement chosen, it could bind a woman completely to her husband's authority or leave her strikingly independent. It was, in short, thoroughly Roman, legalistic, pragmatic, and endlessly preoccupied with getting the paperwork exactly right. Which brings us neatly to the paperwork's favorite companion activity. Because if the Romans excelled at getting married, they were positively gifted at getting divorced. Part 8. Roman divorce shockingly casual, even by modern standards. Divorce in ancient Rome was legal, common, and, especially among the upper classes, remarkably undramatic by the standards of nearly every century that followed. Either spouse could initiate the process, and among Rome's political elite, marriages sometimes dissolved and reformed with a frequency that wouldn't feel out of place in a modern career-changing jobs. A prominent Roman might work through several spouses across a lifetime, each union carefully selected to advance a particular social or political goal. There was typically no lengthy court battle, no requirement of public scandal, simply a formal declaration, and the quiet reshuffling of alliances that followed. Remember the underlying principle. Roman marriage rested on the mutual intention of both parties to remain married. Once that intention disappeared, so, in principle, could the marriage itself. If a couple no longer wished to be together, they simply weren't anymore. No priest needed to grant approval. No court needed to authorize the split. No religious authority needed to be consulted. A declaration, sometimes nothing more than a written notice, and the matter was settled. For a civilization famous for its exhaustive legal detail, divorce was startlingly free of red tape. This produced a marriage culture that, among the elite, could feel dizzyingly fluid. Political alliances between powerful families shifted constantly, and marriages shifted right along with them. A politician might marry into one family to secure a faction's support, then divorce and remarry when the political winds changed direction. Husbands and wives were repositioned like pieces on a strategic board, each move calculated for maximum advantage, with the individuals involved having roughly as much say in the matter as they'd had at the original wedding. And this is worth emphasizing, divorce wasn't purely a tool of the ambitious elite, nor was it always cynically motivated. Ordinary Romans divorced too, for entirely ordinary reasons: incompatibility, infidelity, or simply the gradual realization that the match had been a mistake. Because a woman married under the more independent arrangement retained her own property and dowry, divorce didn't automatically leave her destitute. She could reclaim her assets, return to her birth family, and frequently remarry. It functioned as a genuine exit from an unworkable situation, not merely a trap dressed up as an option. That's not to say it came without consequences. Disputes over dowries were common, arguments broke out over who kept what, and questions surrounding the fate of children, who typically remained with the father's family, could become genuinely painful. Divorce could strain political alliances, damage personal reputations, and generate exactly the kind of gossip Romans famously adored. A woman who divorced too readily, or a man who discarded wives too casually, risked real damage to their public standing. Freedom to divorce didn't mean freedom from judgment. Roman neighbors, as ever, had opinions, and Roman neighbors were merciless. Still, compared to almost everything that followed in European history, Roman divorce looks strikingly progressive. The idea that two people could simply agree the marriage had run its course, divide their property accordingly, and move forward with their lives wouldn't become broadly available in the Western world again for an extraordinarily long time. In a real sense, the Romans had stumbled onto something resembling no-fault divorce. And then, over the next 2,000 years, much of the Western world would slowly and deliberately forget it. Because the reasons people married were about to grow far larger than personal ambition or household management. Once entire kingdoms hung in the balance, marriage stopped being a private matter altogether. It became one of the single most effective weapons a ruler could wield, without ever needing to draw a sword. Part 9. When marriage became a weapon, royal and strategic unions. Let's zoom out now, away from ordinary households and into the palaces, because for kings, queens, and noble families across nearly every era of history, a wedding was never really about two people falling for each other. It was about two kingdoms, two fortunes, or two armies quietly agreeing not to destroy one another for a while longer. Children born into ruling families were engaged before they could form full sentences, their futures traded across borders like the most valuable cards in an enormous, deadly serious game. You didn't marry a person in this world. You married a treaty. And if that treaty later became inconvenient, there were always annulments, convenient legal technicalities, and in the darkest and most whispered about cases, suspiciously timed deaths to fall back on. Try to imagine what it actually felt like to be born into this kind of family. It sounds enviable until you realize what it actually meant in practice. Your entire romantic future became, from birth, a diplomatic resource to be spent at the discretion of people who were not you. Long before you could speak in complete sentences, ambassadors in distant rooms were already discussing your marriage prospects, weighing your value against the territory you might secure, the claims you might strengthen, the wars you might prevent simply by existing and eventually marrying the correct stranger. You were, in the coldest possible sense, a beautifully dressed peace treaty with a pulse, and everyone around you treated you accordingly, from the moment your birth was announced. The underlying logic, however brutal, was undeniably effective. Two rival kingdoms could spend years bleeding each other on the battlefield, exhausting their treasuries and their populations in pursuit of victories that might never fully materialize. Or they could instead marry a prince to a princess, and quietly bind their interests together without losing a single soldier. A well-arranged marriage could end a war outright, seal a fragile alliance, secure a contested border, or plant a legitimate claim on a foreign throne that might otherwise have required decades of conflict to establish. Entire dynasties rose not through conquest on the battlefield, but through exceptionally well-planned marriage strategy executed patiently across generations. And the stakes involved made these unions almost unbearably tense for everyone concerned. A queen's single most important responsibility was frequently the production of a male heir, and failure to deliver one could unravel an entire dynasty's carefully built position. A marriage that produced no son at all might eventually be declared cursed by whispering courtiers, quietly set aside, or annulled outright in favor of a fresh arrangement offering better prospects. Wives who failed to produce the required heir sometimes found themselves cast aside entirely, confined, or in the worst documented cases, eliminated, their entire value in the marriage having rested on a biological outcome that no one, least of all them, could actually control or guarantee. The children born into these arrangements grew up understanding the truth of their situation from an extremely early age. They would marry whomever the family's political interests demanded, full stop. Love wasn't merely considered irrelevant in this context. It was viewed as potentially dangerous, a distraction capable of tempting a prince or princess into an unwise match that could jeopardize alliances painstakingly built over many years. A prince who fell genuinely in love with an unsuitable partner, or a princess who resisted the husband selected for her, could single-handedly unravel treaties that had taken a decade of careful diplomacy to construct. Personal desire in this world was a luxury the most powerful people alive specifically could not afford, one of history's great, quiet ironies. The people with the most command over other human beings frequently had the least command over their own hearts. When these carefully engineered marriages inevitably soured, and many of them did, the available exits could be spectacular. Because the medieval church had made outright divorce nearly impossible across Christian Europe, powerful rulers grew remarkably creative in finding alternatives. Annulments were pursued on the flimsiest of technicalities. Marriages were retroactively declared to have never been legally valid in the first place, often years or even decades after the wedding had taken place, with the full knowledge and consent of everyone involved. And in the very darkest instances, an inconvenient spouse simply died under circumstances so suspiciously convenient that even contemporaries at the time raised their eyebrows and lowered their voices. For all the genuine human misery this system inflicted on the individuals trapped inside it, it undeniably shaped the map of the known world in lasting ways. Borders shifted according to marriage contracts. Empires expanded and contracted based on who married whom. Entire dynasties rose to prominence or collapsed into obscurity based on the strength or the catastrophic weakness of a single strategic union. The great political story of much of human history was written not only on battlefields, but in wedding contracts negotiated in quiet rooms by people who never once considered the couple's actual feelings. And if royalty engineered marriages on the scale of entire kingdoms, ordinary powerful families, nobles, merchants, landowners, played precisely the same game on a smaller, more intimate scale, frequently committing their own children to these arrangements before those children were even remotely old enough to understand what was being decided on their behalf. Part 10. Betrothed in the Cradle: Childhood Marriage Contracts. Here's an uncomfortable chapter, so prepare yourself accordingly. Across many eras and cultures throughout history, children were formally betrothed at astonishingly young ages, sometimes literally as infants, promised in binding agreements to a future partner they might not actually meet in person for years afterward. The genuine cohabitation and full marriage typically waited until both parties were considerably older, but the underlying legal and social deal itself was struck extremely early, specifically to lock in valuable alliances, land, and inheritance rights before any rival family could intervene. Try to imagine discovering, as a small child, that your entire future spouse had already been selected and formally agreed upon while you were still losing your baby teeth. Let's be precise here, because the historical reality is genuinely complicated and shouldn't be flattened into a single simple narrative. In many societies, particularly among wealthy and powerful families with substantial estates and alliances to protect, a betrothal, the formal, binding promise that a marriage would eventually take place, could be arranged in early childhood or, in some documented cases, even infancy. The actual marriage ceremony, and especially the beginning of cohabitation, typically came much later, often not until the couple reached their mid to late teenage years. But the underlying arrangement itself was locked into place extremely early, meaning a child could grow up with their entire adult future already decided, signed, and formally witnessed by adults who, in many cases, wouldn't even live to see how the eventual marriage turned out. The reasoning behind all of this was, depressingly, the same set of motivations driving nearly every other custom we've covered so far tonight: property, political power, and long-term security. A betrothal arranged during childhood secured a valuable alliance before a rival family could snatch the opportunity away first. It bound two households together for years in advance, giving both sides a genuine financial and political stake in the other's continued fortunes. It protected inheritances from being contested and cemented territorial or dynastic claims well ahead of time. For a noble family with significant assets at stake, waiting until children had grown into adulthood before arranging their marriages represented an unacceptable risk. The ideal match might be claimed by a rival family in the meantime. The broader political situation might shift unpredictably, or a carefully identified advantage might simply evaporate before it could be secured. Far safer, from a purely strategic standpoint, to lock the arrangement in early and eliminate the uncertainty altogether. For the children caught inside these arrangements, this meant growing up as the living subject of a plan they had absolutely no part in creating. Some betrothed pairs were deliberately raised with awareness of one another from an early age, occasionally even brought up partially within the same household, specifically so they'd grow accustomed to their eventual spouse well before the actual wedding arrived. Others didn't meet their intended partner at all until shortly before the ceremony itself, walking toward a complete stranger they had been legally promised to since before either of them could walk. Either way, the single most important fact of their entire life had been settled long before they were ever given any meaningful say in the matter. It's worth resisting the temptation, however, to imagine the absolute worst outcome in every single case. because the historical reality was genuinely varied. Many childhood betrothals functioned essentially as extremely long engagements, with the actual marriage and cohabitation deliberately delayed until the young people involved were considered developmentally ready. Some societies developed specific customs intended to protect very young brides from premature consummation or excessive hardship, and certain betrothals could be broken or renegotiated if circumstances shifted significantly enough. Genuine affection did sometimes grow naturally between pairs who had been raised with an awareness of each other from childhood, and not every arranged childhood match ended in tragedy or misery. But the underlying reality remained stark regardless of these mitigating cases. Children were being formally committed to lifelong unions purely as instruments of family strategy, and the genuine abuses within this system were very real and shouldn't be softened by historical distance. In far too many times and places, young girls in particular were married at ages we would today consider deeply inappropriate, their childhoods cut dramatically short by the demands of an adult institution they were nowhere near ready to participate in. The consequences ranged from lost education and a stolen childhood to genuine, serious physical danger and harm. This remains one of the darker threads running through the broader history of marriage, and it deserves to be named plainly and honestly rather than romanticized or softened by nostalgic distance. Those earlier centuries were frequently not gentle, simple times. They were often genuinely brutal, especially for the very young people caught within these systems. What unites every example we've discussed so far, the infant betrothals, the strategic royal pairings, entire childhood spent as bargaining chips in someone else's political calculations, is the near total absence of the individual's own choice in the matter. And yet, for centuries upon centuries, this was simply understood as how the serious business of marriage was properly conducted, particularly among families with anything substantial worth protecting or expanding. But somebody somewhere had to actually do the practical work of arranging all these matches, identifying which families paired well together, which dowry could realistically seal which particular deal, which reputations could be quietly managed, and which needed to be avoided entirely. That someone was a dedicated professional whose entire livelihood depended on pairing off complete strangers with an almost surgical degree of accuracy. A figure history remembers, with good reason, as the matchmaker. Part 11. The Matchmaker, Love Engineering before algorithms. Long before any dating app decided algorithmically who you might fall for, there existed the professional matchmaker, and this was a role taken with tremendous seriousness across countless cultures around the world. Skilled matchmakers studied families, fortunes, reputations, and in many traditions, even astrological charts, in order to pair people together with an almost surgical degree of precision. They knew virtually every eligible person across their entire region, every simmering family scandal, and exactly which dowry arrangement could plausibly seal which particular deal. Being matched by one of these professionals was never remotely romantic. It functioned more like being carefully audited by someone who also happened to be planning your entire wedding on the side. And crucially, the actual goal was never your personal happiness. The goal always was a stable and sensible arrangement that both families involved could comfortably live with for the following decades. Picture the matchmaker actually at work within her community. This figure was very often an older woman, remarkably sharp-eyed and impossibly well-informed, who moved through her town or village like a walking, breathing database of every marriageable person within reach. She knew precisely who had recently come of age, whose father was quietly struggling with debt, whose daughter was locally renowned for her weaving or her cooking, and whose son carried a reputation that required careful, discreet management before any serious match could be proposed. Nothing meaningful escaped her attention. In a world entirely without photographs, profiles, or public records, she effectively functioned as the search engine, the background check, and the skilled negotiator, all rolled into one remarkably capable person. Her working methods were rigorous in ways that would genuinely exhaust a modern dating app's entire engineering team. She carefully weighed one family's social standing against another's, verified that social status lined up appropriately on both sides, and calculated whether a proposed dowry and bride price could realistically be reconciled without insulting either family involved. In cultures that placed weight on astrology, she compared birth charts to determine whether a couple was considered cosmically compatible, because satisfying the families involved simply wasn't sufficient on its own. You also, apparently, had to satisfy the heavens. A match that appeared flawless on paper from every practical angle could still be abandoned entirely over an unfavorable astrological alignment that nobody present was in any position to argue against. The discretion demanded by this role was genuinely immense. A working matchmaker held the private secrets of dozens of interconnected families simultaneously, and a single careless word spoken at the wrong moment could permanently destroy a reputation or collapse a delicate negotiation that had taken months to construct. She learned, through hard experience, to hint carefully, to suggest possibilities gently, to test the waters diplomatically without ever committing either family prematurely to a match that might ultimately fall through. Two families might quietly explore a potential match through her for several weeks before either side officially acknowledged any interest publicly, with everyone involved carefully maintaining plausible deniability in case the whole arrangement eventually collapsed. This was delicate diplomacy conducted entirely through a single trusted intermediary, and a single wrong move at any stage could transform a promising union into a lasting, bitter grudge between two families. Here's the detail that genuinely surprises most people learning about this system for the first time. The matchmaker very often had a genuinely strong track record, at least measured by the standards of her own time. Because she wasn't matching people based on passion or attraction, she was matching for long-term durability. She deliberately paired people from similar social backgrounds, compatible family structures, and comparable practical expectations, which meant the resulting marriages, whatever their actual emotional temperature turned out to be, tended overwhelmingly toward long-term stability. Nobody was blindsided by wildly incompatible values or expectations, because all of that had already been carefully checked and verified well in advance of the wedding itself. It was, in effect, love engineering with the romantic component deliberately removed, and the practical engineering component cranked up to its absolute maximum. Of course, the couple actually at the center of all this had roughly the same practical influence over the outcome as a minor rounding error in the overall calculation. They might occasionally be consulted on some minor point, might even be permitted a single brief, closely supervised meeting before the arrangement was formally finalized. But the real decision-making power rested entirely with the families involved and the matchmaker serving them. A young person's actual job within this system was simply to trust the established process, to honor their parents' considered judgment, and to sincerely hope that the stranger ultimately selected for them turned out to be reasonably tolerable to live alongside for the next several decades. Objecting too strenuously to the arrangement wasn't merely considered rude. It could genuinely shame an entire family and seriously damage everyone's future standing within the community. The matchmaker's central role in society persisted for an extraordinarily long stretch of history, and in various evolving forms, it never fully disappeared even as circumstances changed dramatically around it. The basic human instinct to have someone genuinely knowledgeable curate your available romantic options, filter out the obvious disasters in advance, and present only carefully vetted, suitable candidates is precisely what modern matchmaking services and dating algorithms explicitly promise to deliver today. In a real sense, we've simply replaced a shrewd, well-connected older woman who personally knew everyone's business with a massive server farm that, if anything, now knows considerably more of it. But even the most skilled and well-connected matchmaker ultimately operated within limits eventually set by a far greater and more powerful authority. Because in Europe, marriage itself was about to be claimed almost entirely by an institution considerably more powerful than any village matchmaker or family elder, one that would go on to dictate the fundamental rules of marriage for the next 1,000 years. Part 12. The Church claims marriage. Let's talk about the single moment marriage got religion, because it changed absolutely everything that followed. For centuries, marriage across Europe had remained largely a private, family-run affair that the organized church didn't involve itself in very heavily. But gradually, over a long stretch of time, Christianity increasingly claimed marriage as a sacred institution in its own right, eventually declaring it a full sacrament. Suddenly, your marital union wasn't simply witnessed by your neighbors and family members. It was witnessed, according to official doctrine, by God Himself, formally blessed by an ordained priest, and consequently far harder to ever legitimately escape. What had once been a flexible arrangement negotiated between families slowly hardened, over generations, into a lifelong, heaven-sanctioned bond. The paperwork, so to speak, migrated from the family dinner table to the church altar. For a considerable stretch of early medieval life, this transition happened gradually and remained genuinely incomplete for a very long time. Vast numbers of ordinary marriages took place without any priest anywhere nearby. Two people would simply exchange spoken words of consent, perhaps in front of a handful of witnesses, perhaps beside a roadside, perhaps inside a tavern, and by the standards of the time and place, they were considered genuinely married. The church generally recognized these informal unions as valid, but it wasn't yet actively controlling how or where they happened. Marriage remained, at this stage, fundamentally something people did to and for each other directly, rather than something an external institution imposed upon them. That situation would eventually change, slowly at first and then quite decisively. As the centuries passed, the church steadily tightened its practical grip over the institution. It began actively insisting that marriages be conducted properly, publicly, and specifically with its formal blessing attached. It introduced the now familiar practice of reading the banns, public announcements of an upcoming marriage, repeated aloud over several consecutive weeks, so that any objections, secret prior marriages, or forbidden family relationships could be identified and addressed before the wedding actually proceeded. This served a genuinely practical function, helping to reduce instances of bigamy and outright fraud, but it was also unmistakably about consolidating institutional authority. The underlying message was increasingly clear. Marriage was now the church's business, and conducting it improperly had become a genuinely serious matter with real consequences. The formal declaration of marriage as a sacrament represented the crucial turning point in this entire transformation. A sacrament, according to church doctrine, wasn't merely a social arrangement or a straightforward legal contract between two parties. It was understood as a sacred channel of divine grace, established directly by God Himself. This elevated the status of marriage enormously within Christian society, but it also transformed the institution into something almost impossible to legitimately undo once entered into. If God Himself had joined a particular couple together, what standing did any mere human authority have to separate them afterward? Divorce, in the sense the Romans had casually practiced it, simply dissolving a valid marriage and freely remarrying afterward, became essentially unavailable across Christian Europe for a very long historical period. The Roman world's relatively casual exits from unwanted marriages vanished almost entirely, replaced by a bond that was now explicitly meant to endure until death separated the couple. This shift created the genuinely peculiar institution of the annulment, which we'll return to shortly in more detail. But its very existence tells you almost everything you need to know about the new underlying logic being applied. since a truly valid sacramental marriage couldn't be dissolved once properly established. The only remaining escape route was to somehow prove the marriage had never actually been valid in the first place. That some hidden flaw, some overlooked impediment, some obscure technicality meant God had never genuinely joined this particular couple together at all, regardless of appearances. It was simultaneously a legal loophole and a theological one, and it transformed countless unhappy spouses into amateur canon lawyers desperately combing through the details of their own wedding, searching for any defect that might unlock a legitimate exit. The church also concerned itself deeply and genuinely with the question of consent, and this development carried a surprisingly important long-term consequence. Church teaching increasingly held that a truly valid marriage required the freely given consent of both parties involved, not merely the ambitions and arrangements of their respective families. In theory, this meant a marriage conducted entirely against someone's genuine will could potentially be formally challenged afterward. In a world still dominated by arranged matches and considerable family pressure, this notion of free consent was often more of an aspirational ideal than an accurately reflected reality on the ground. But the underlying principle mattered enormously regardless, because it planted a genuinely radical seed within Western thought. The idea that a legitimate marriage should actually involve the real, willing participation of the two people getting married, rather than existing purely as a vehicle for their families' separate ambitions. By the height of the medieval period, the church had thoroughly woven itself into every meaningful stage of the marriage process. The public announcement, the ceremony itself, the priestly blessing, the detailed rules governing exactly who could marry whom, and the near-total prohibition on ever legitimately getting back out again. Marriage had become, in official doctrine at least, a sacred, lifelong, divinely sanctioned bond, with the ordained priesthood now sitting firmly at its institutional center. But sacred theology inevitably collided with the muddy, practical reality of ordinary daily life. And for the average medieval peasant working the fields, marriage looked considerably less heavenly in practice, and considerably more grounded in sheer practicality. Part 13. The Peasant's Wedding. Time now to meet the ordinary people, because most historical weddings were never royal spectacles at all. They were muddy, deeply practical, and refreshingly unglamorous affairs. For the typical medieval peasant, marriage centered fundamentally on labor, land, and basic survival. You married someone from your own village, someone whose family your own family already knew intimately, someone capable of working a field competently and enduring a harsh winter without complaint. Genuine love might eventually arrive, almost as a pleasant surprise discovered well after the fact, but it was never really the central point of the arrangement. The actual point was two separate households effectively becoming one slightly more survivable household, and the wedding itself was often nothing more than a few spoken words exchanged, sometimes without any priest present at all. Consider for a moment who you would have actually been permitted to marry, because your realistic options were genuinely, almost comically limited. You lived your entire life within a radius of perhaps a few miles from wherever you happened to be born, surrounded constantly by the same familiar faces, the same interconnected families, the same tangled web of relationships that any modern person would need considerable time to properly untangle. Your eventual spouse was almost certainly someone you had personally known since early childhood, a neighbor, a fellow field laborer, someone from the farm immediately next door. There was no vast pool of eligible prospects to consider, no meaningful opportunity to travel and meet exciting strangers from distant places. There was simply the village, and within that village, a relatively small handful of people roughly your own age who weren't inconveniently already related to you through some branch of the family tree. Practicality governed virtually every decision made in this context. A genuinely good spouse, by peasant standards, was someone demonstrably capable of hard physical work. A wife who could brew ale competently, bake bread reliably, tend animals skillfully, spin wool, manage an entire household efficiently, and labor alongside you in the fields when the harvest demanded it was worth considerably more, in practical terms, than one who was merely pleasant to look at. A husband who was physically strong, dependable, and genuinely skilled with basic tools represented a real and valuable asset to any household. When families carefully assessed a potential match, they weren't asking whether the young couple's hearts fluttered in each other's presence. They were asking a far more practical question. Could these two specific people survive together long-term, successfully produce children, and keep a modest farm functioning through both good years and genuinely catastrophic ones? Land, as always throughout this entire story, sat quietly at the very center of everything that mattered. Marriage frequently involved the formal transfer or combination of small landholdings, the securing of established rights to work certain strips of a local lord's fields, or the practical joining of two families' otherwise modest combined resources. Even among people who owned almost nothing of significant value, the little they did possess mattered enormously, and marriage functioned as the primary mechanism through which that limited property was passed on, carefully protected, and gradually pooled together. A genuinely well-matched peasant marriage could realistically mean the difference between a family that managed to scrape by successfully and one that slowly slid into genuine destitution over time. The wedding ceremony itself could be startlingly casual by our own modern standards, since a fundamentally valid marriage required, at its core, only the couple's genuine mutual consent. Two people could, in principle, marry each other simply by exchanging spoken words of present consent, even entirely without a priest present or any formal church ceremony involved. These informal peasant unions were common enough throughout much of the medieval period that the church spent considerable institutional effort trying to bring the practice under proper supervision, insisting increasingly on bans, formal blessings, and public ceremonies conducted with appropriate oversight. But in actual daily practice, plenty of ordinary peasant couples married in ways that centered more on the local community's simple recognition and acceptance than on any elaborate formal rite conducted by church authorities. When there genuinely was a celebration to mark the occasion, it functioned as a full village affair involving the entire local community. A wedding represented a rare and precious chance to feast, drink, and dance together in lives that were otherwise filled almost entirely with grinding, repetitive daily labor. Neighbors gathered together from across the surrounding area. Ale flowed freely for one of the few occasions all year, and for a single brief day, the relentless daily work genuinely paused. The newly married couple might receive small practical gifts intended to help establish their new household: a cooking pot, some woven cloth, a few farm animals, modest, practical contributions toward a fundamentally practical union. It certainly wasn't lavish by any measure, but in a genuinely hard world, a wedding represented a real and cherished bright spot worth savoring for years afterward in memory. And genuine love, it should be said, absolutely did happen within these peasant marriages, just usually in a different order than we might expect today. Real affection frequently grew steadily after the wedding had already taken place, forged gradually through shared daily struggle, shared children, and shared long-term survival against difficult odds. Couples who began their married life as purely sensible, practical matches often became genuinely devoted lifelong partners over the course of decades, spent facing hardship together side by side. The nobility, however, played by an entirely different and considerably higher stakes set of rules. Because when castles, hereditary titles, and vast landed estates were genuinely at stake, marriage stopped being fundamentally about surviving a difficult winter and started being about something considerably more complicated: surviving each other, and surviving the relentless political demands placed upon an entire dynasty. Part 14. The noble marriage, high stakes behind castle walls. Now let's step directly into the drafty stone castle, because among the nobility, marriage represented serious business carried out at genuinely enormous stakes. For noble families across medieval Europe, a well-arranged marriage could win valuable new territory outright, forge a powerful and lasting political alliance, or secure an entire family bloodline for multiple future generations. Love in this rarefied social world was at absolute best a distant rumor, something that happened to other, less important people. Brides and grooms alike were selected primarily for their existing family connections, their expected inheritances, and their overall usefulness to political ambitions considerably larger than themselves as individuals. A genuinely well-arranged match could elevate an entire dynasty's fortunes for generations to come. A poorly arranged one could doom that same dynasty just as thoroughly. So the young couple stood together at the altar as virtual strangers to one another, while their respective parents beamed with satisfaction at what was, in essence, an extremely successful business merger dressed up in ceremonial finery. The sheer difference in scale, compared to a typical peasant marriage, was genuinely staggering. Where an ordinary farmer might combine two small adjoining plots of land through marriage, a noble marriage could combine two entire vast estates, joining together sprawling territories, castles, and substantial streams of income that supported hundreds of dependent people across multiple households. Where a peasant family's marriage secured basic day-to-day survival, a noble family's marriage secured genuine political power stretching across generations. The consequences of a particularly good or catastrophically bad match rippled outward across entire regions and continued echoing down through subsequent decades. This was marriage functioning as high-stakes statecraft, conducted by families who had learned to think primarily in terms of bloodlines rather than individual human lifetimes. Because so much genuinely rode on the outcome, the overall selection process was ruthless and typically began at a remarkably early age. Noble children were treated as valuable strategic pieces to be positioned advantageously on a much larger political board, and their eventual marriages were carefully negotiated by parents, trusted advisors, and sometimes powerful overlords who had their own separate political interests at stake in the outcome. A daughter might be formally promised in marriage specifically to strengthen a fragile alliance with a rival noble family. A son might be carefully matched to an heiress whose lands the family had long coveted for strategic reasons. The young people directly involved were consulted only rarely, if at all, and expected to comply obediently in virtually every case. To openly refuse an advantageous match arranged by one's family was to directly defy both family ambition and personal duty simultaneously, and very few individuals possessed the social standing necessary to successfully do so. The dowry and the broader marriage settlement were negotiated with an intensity fully comparable to formal international treaty negotiations, because in a very real practical sense, that's precisely what they were. Enormous sums of money, extensive tracts of land, and remarkably detailed contractual arrangements concerning future inheritance were carefully hammered out well in advance, often documented with truly exacting legal precision. What the bride would bring into the marriage, what guarantees the groom's family would provide in return, what would happen to jointly held property if either spouse died prematurely, precisely how any future children would eventually inherit. All of it was thoroughly settled before the wedding ever took place, sometimes literally years in advance, by people focused entirely and exclusively on strategic advantage. Romance, quite simply, had no meaningful seat whatsoever at that particular negotiating table. Producing a legitimate heir represented the towering, overriding obligation hanging over every single noble marriage without exception. A legitimate son capable of inheriting the family's title and lands was frequently understood as the entire fundamental purpose of the union, and the resulting pressure placed on a noble wife to successfully deliver one was consequently immense. A marriage that produced only daughters, or that produced no children at all, could throw an entire family's future into genuine crisis, sparking bitter inheritance disputes, desperate political maneuvering among rival claimants, and sometimes a grim, calculated search for some legitimate way to set the marriage aside entirely. A noble wife's overall standing within her own household and community often rose or fell entirely based on whether she successfully bore the required son. A heavy burden placed squarely on her shoulders, regardless of the fact that she had genuinely no meaningful control whatsoever over the biological outcome. The wedding of a noble couple represented a public spectacle in ways a simple peasant wedding never remotely could. It functioned as a highly visible public demonstration of accumulated wealth, political power, and strategic alliance, deliberately staged to impress important assembled guests and to formally announce the newly combined strength of two great noble houses. There were often multi-day feasts that stretched on for days at a time, elaborate displays of fine clothing and jewelry, and an audience specifically composed of important political guests, whose very attendance carried genuine political weight and meaning in its own right. The ceremony itself wasn't merely a marriage in the personal sense. It functioned as a deliberate political statement, broadcast clearly to both allies and potential rivals alike, regarding the substantial new combined strength the two families now commanded together. For the actual couple standing at the very center of all this elaborate ceremony and political calculation, personal feeling was almost entirely beside the point. They might, over time, grow to genuinely respect or even love one another, or they might instead spend their entire lives together as cordial strangers, jointly managing what amounted to a shared political and economic enterprise. Either outcome was considered broadly acceptable within this system, so long as the underlying political alliance held firm and the required heir eventually arrived as expected. With so much elaborate ritual and genuine political consequence packed into every noble wedding ceremony, it's worth pausing here to examine the ceremonies themselves in more detail. Because across the full sweep of human history, the countless different ways humans have chosen to formally mark a marriage as officially recognized turn out to be wonderfully, sometimes bizarrely varied. Part 15. The strange theater of the wedding ceremony. Let's talk now about the ceremony itself, because across cultures and centuries, the actual mechanics of getting married have been gloriously, sometimes bewilderingly strange. Cultures around the world have bound couples' hands together with cord, had them leap over brooms, shattered pottery deliberately underfoot, shared bread and salt between them, and passed an almost endless parade of symbolic objects back and forth between one another. Some of these rituals centered on luck, some on fertility, some on warding off malevolent spirits who apparently held very strong opinions about any newly forming relationship. The specific details varied enormously from place to place, but the underlying human instinct behind all of it remained remarkably universal. People needed some tangible way to mark the moment, to make an invisible change in relationship status feel genuinely official, to transform a private decision into something the entire surrounding community could witness and remember clearly afterward. Consider hand fasting as one particularly vivid example, a custom in which a couple's hands were quite literally bound together using cord or ribbon, which is, incidentally, where the enduring phrase tying the knot actually originates. The symbolism here is almost too direct to require much explanation. Two separate people physically joined together, their new union made immediately visible in a simple loop of woven fabric. It was simple, tactile, and genuinely powerful, exactly the kind of gesture that required no accompanying explanation whatsoever. You could be entirely unable to read, understand not a single word of the ceremony's spoken language, and still grasp with total clarity exactly what it meant to watch two hands bound together as one. Then there's the wonderfully varied world of ritual objects, because it seems humans have never once encountered a wedding they couldn't accessorize with layers of additional meaning. Couples throughout history have shared bread and salt together, drunk from a single shared cup, exchanged small symbolic tokens, and passed meaningful items back and forth between themselves and their families. In some traditions, the deliberate breaking of an object, a glass, a plate, a piece of pottery, formed the genuine centerpiece of the entire ceremony, with the sound of shattering representing everything from the essential fragility of human life to the sheer permanence of the couple's new commitment to one another, to simple good fortune going forward. The distinctive sound of breaking crockery has echoed through wedding ceremonies across an enormous range of different cultures for a very long time, which is either deeply symbolic, simply satisfying to witness, or quite possibly both simultaneously. Fertility, perhaps unsurprisingly given everything we've already covered tonight, formed a recurring obsession throughout wedding customs worldwide, because the entire underlying point of most historical marriages was ultimately children. Rituals across a huge range of different cultures incorporated symbols of natural abundance, gestures specifically meant to encourage a fruitful union, and customs that showered the newly married couple with items representing plenty and growth, grains, seeds, and various other tokens of natural fertility. The now familiar modern habit of tossing rice or paper confetti over newlyweds represents a faint, cheerful modern echo of much older, considerably more anxious ancient concerns about whether a given couple would successfully produce the next generation. What looks today like harmless fun was, in its original form, essentially a genuine plea directed toward the forces of nature. Warding off bad luck and malevolent spirits formed another persistent theme running throughout wedding customs worldwide, and it produced some genuinely memorable traditions. Loud noise, bright light, veils, and specific meaningful colors all played protective roles across various different wedding traditions, generally intended to confuse or actively repel whatever malevolent forces might otherwise take a dangerous interest in a newly vulnerable couple. The bridal veil, for instance, carried multiple layered meanings across different cultures: modesty, mystery, spiritual protection, and the broader concept of shielding the bride specifically from potential misfortune ran consistently through many of these traditions. A wedding, in this worldview, wasn't simply a joyful social occasion. It represented a genuine moment of spiritual vulnerability that required careful, deliberate management. What's genuinely striking, looking back across all of this, is how consistently the same deep underlying human instincts surface again and again across wildly different cultural forms. Binding hands together, sharing food and drink, deliberately breaking objects, showering couples with symbols of abundance, veiling the bride for protection, cultures that had absolutely no historical contact with one another whatsoever nonetheless arrived independently at strikingly similar underlying impulses, because they were all fundamentally wrestling with the exact same underlying truth. A marriage represents an essentially invisible thing, a genuine change in relationship status that can't actually be seen or physically touched. Ritual makes that invisible change feel real and tangible. It gives the surrounding community a clear moment to witness, a specific memory to hold on to afterward, and an unmistakable dividing line between before and after. One moment, two separate individuals stand there. The next moment, once the knot has been tied or the shared cup has been passed between them, they have become something genuinely new together. And among all these countless symbolic objects and elaborate ceremonial gestures, one particularly small item would eventually outlast nearly all the others, quietly circling the finger of married people continuously for literally thousands of years, right up through the present day. Part 16. The wedding ring, a small object with an enormous history. Here we have a remarkably small object carrying an absolutely enormous historical weight: the wedding ring itself. The basic idea of a ring symbolizing marriage stretches back many thousands of years, traditionally worn as a physical token of a bond that, much like the unbroken circle itself, was understood to have no natural end point. Ancient thinkers in several different cultures genuinely believed that one particular finger contained a special vein running directly to the heart, a charming, deeply romantic idea that happens to be completely and thoroughly wrong from an anatomical standpoint. But apparently nobody at the time felt any particular need to actually check. Over time, the ring gradually evolved into a near-universal symbol worldwide, functioning as a portable, immediately readable announcement to the entire surrounding world that a given person was, in fact, already spoken for. One small metal band doing the considerable heavy lifting of communicating, essentially, "I'm sorry, but I'm already taken," to anyone who happened to glance at the correct finger. The underlying symbolism of the circular shape itself did an enormous amount of communicative work on its own. A ring, by its basic geometric nature, has no clear beginning point and no clear ending point, no visible seam marking where it technically starts or stops, which made it an almost irresistibly perfect metaphor for a bond that was explicitly meant to last forever without interruption. In a world where most ordinary people had no access to formal written records documenting their personal lives, a simple physical object that visibly declared, "This person is married," to anyone who looked, was genuinely useful information to carry around. It represented information you literally wore directly on your hand, readable at an instant glance, requiring absolutely no further explanation from anyone. The ring effectively said everything a formal marriage certificate would eventually come to say later in history. Except, notably, a ring never got accidentally lost at the bottom of some drawer. The famous, widely believed notion about a special ring finger connected directly to the heart represents one of history's most genuinely charming persistent errors. Ancient thinkers across multiple cultures maintained that one particular finger contained a special vein, sometimes referred to poetically as the vein of love, running directly from that finger to the heart, which naturally made it the ideal location for wearing a symbol of devoted love. It's a beautifully romantic notion, and it happens to be complete biological nonsense. There is, in reality, no such dedicated vein anywhere in the human hand, and every single finger connects back to the heart in precisely the same thoroughly unremarkable way as every other finger. But the underlying idea proved simply too poetic and appealing to abandon, and it consequently persisted for many centuries, continuing to shape exactly where people choose to wear their wedding rings right up to the present day. Early wedding rings were considerably humbler than the elaborate diamond-studded objects we tend to picture today when we imagine one. Depending on the specific historical era and the personal wealth of the individual wearer, early rings might consist of nothing more than simple bands of iron, bronze, or other plain metal, valued considerably more for what they symbolically represented than for what they had actually cost to produce. A genuinely humble, inexpensive ring carried precisely the same underlying symbolic meaning as an elaborate, expensive one worn by nobility. The essential point was always the symbol itself, never the attached price tag. Society's later obsession with expensive gemstones, and the now widespread notion that a proper engagement ring should represent a genuinely significant financial sacrifice on the giver's part, came along considerably later in history, driven at least as much by clever, deliberate marketing campaigns as by any genuine ancient tradition. The wedding ring also carried a quieter, less flattering undercurrent of ownership and social obligation, particularly for women throughout much of recorded history, a visible way of publicly declaring oneself bound, officially off the market, formally committed. This functioned partly as a genuinely lovely statement of personal devotion, and partly as an entirely practical piece of social signaling within a world where one's marital status governed enormous, far-reaching portions of daily life. The ring communicated to others exactly how they were expected to treat you, what your social responsibilities now were, and precisely where you stood within the broader community's social structure. It fused genuine affection and practical information together into a single small object, worn prominently where absolutely everyone could easily see it. Over the following centuries, this particular custom spread widely and continued evolving, appearing in numerous different forms across an enormous range of cultures, and eventually becoming one of the single most instantly recognizable symbols of marriage found anywhere on the planet. The formal exchange of rings during the wedding ceremony itself became a central, emotionally charged moment within the proceedings. The specific instant when the previously abstract promise of marriage suddenly became a tangible physical object you could slip directly onto another person's finger. Remarkably few gestures throughout the entire history of human ritual have proven quite so durable or so widely adopted across such vastly different cultures. It's genuinely remarkable when you actually stop to consider it properly. Entire empires have risen to prominence and subsequently collapsed into ruin. Whole religious traditions have transformed themselves dramatically over time. The very fundamental meaning of marriage itself has shifted substantially beneath people's feet across the centuries. And through absolutely all of it, one small metal circle has continued quietly performing its modest job. The wedding ring has genuinely outlasted almost every other custom appearing anywhere in this entire story. A tiny, remarkably stubborn survivor of humanity's very long-running romance with symbolic meaning. But no ring, however symbolically important, was ever truly the actual main event at a historical wedding. That particular honor belonged instead to the feast, the loud, joyful, frequently ruinously expensive celebration that transformed a private union between two people into what often amounted to the social event of the entire year. Part 17. The Wedding Feast. Let's properly set the tables now, because for most of recorded human history, the wedding feast genuinely mattered every bit as much as the wedding ceremony itself. In a world dominated by hard physical labor and frequently lean times, a wedding provided a legitimate excuse for the entire surrounding community to eat well, drink freely, dance, and briefly forget about how genuinely difficult everyday life otherwise was. Families would routinely spend fortunes they didn't actually possess in order to throw a celebration that would be talked about admiringly for years afterward. The bigger and more lavish the celebration, the greater the resulting social honor, and correspondingly, the deeper the resulting debt. Some fundamental human patterns, it seems, genuinely never change. The couple at the actual center of all this, meanwhile, was very often simply exhausted, thoroughly overwhelmed, and mostly just quietly hoping everyone would eventually go home so they could finally rest. It's worth properly understanding what a feast actually meant within a broader world defined by genuine scarcity. For ordinary people throughout most of history, daily life consisted of a fairly monotonous grind, the same plain food day after day, the same relentless physical labor, the same careful, anxious rationing driven by constant fear of a potential bad harvest. A wedding shattered that grinding monotony completely, at least for a single day. Suddenly there was actual meat on the table, in a world where meat was otherwise genuinely rare. There was ale flowing freely, in a world where every single drop was normally counted and carefully rationed. There was music, there was dancing, and there was the rare, genuinely delicious permission to simply stop working entirely and properly enjoy oneself for once. For the assembled guests, a wedding wasn't merely a celebration honoring the couple. It represented one of the very few genuine parties that ordinary daily life actually offered anyone. Because the feast carried such enormous accumulated social weight, families very often poured resources into it far beyond what they could genuinely comfortably afford. The overall size and richness of the celebration effectively broadcast the hosting family's social status to the entire surrounding community all at once. A suitably generous feast earned genuine respect, widespread admiration, and considerable lasting goodwill. A comparatively stingy one, by contrast, invited quiet whispers and lasting social contempt. So families routinely stretched their finances, borrowed heavily, and spent freely, treating the wedding feast essentially as a direct investment in their own long-term social standing. If any of this sounds uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has recently looked at a modern wedding invoice and felt genuinely faint, that's largely because this particular underlying impulse is genuinely thousands of years old and shows absolutely no sign of disappearing anytime soon. The feast also functioned as a genuine communal obligation, every bit as much as it did a straightforward celebration. Guests traditionally arrived bearing gifts, practical contributions, and direct help: food for the communal tables, small useful items intended for the couple's new household, physical labor to help prepare the entire event. In tightly knit rural communities, a wedding represented something the entire village actively participated in creating together, rather than merely something people passively attended as spectators. This effectively spread the considerable overall cost and effort involved across the whole community, and it simultaneously wove the new marriage firmly into the community's broader social fabric. By eating together at the feast and contributing gifts to the new couple, everyone present formally acknowledged and actively supported the resulting union. For the wealthy and genuinely powerful, the wedding feast could reach truly extraordinary heights of extravagance. Noble wedding celebrations sometimes lasted for multiple consecutive days, featuring lavish displays of exotic imported foods, elaborate entertainment, and fine clothing, specifically designed to properly awe important assembled guests, and formally announce the family's considerable overall power and wealth. These events functioned as genuine political occasions every bit as much as personal celebrations, moments where important political alliances were formally affirmed, and social status was displayed in the most literal, edible form imaginable. The sheer scale of the excess itself carried the intended message: look at what our family can genuinely afford. Look at how many powerful friends we can command. Look at the combined strength of the two great houses now formally joined together. And these celebrations could genuinely get quite rowdy. Wedding feasts throughout recorded history were widely known for their revelry, their heavy drinking, their bawdy humor, and their occasional descent into outright chaos as the night wore on. The particular combination of abundant alcohol, heightened emotion, and a crowd temporarily freed from ordinary daily restraint reliably produced exactly the kind of boisterous scenes you'd naturally imagine. There were traditional toasts and drinking songs, playful games and gentle jokes made at the newly married couple's expense, and a general pervasive atmosphere of unleashed festivity that could easily tip over into genuine disorder as the ale supply ran low, and the night stretched on considerably longer than originally planned. Through absolutely all of this elaborate celebration, the newlyweds themselves very often occupied a genuinely strange social position. Simultaneously, the undisputed center of everyone's attention, yet somehow also curiously reduced to mere bystanders at their own celebration, thoroughly exhausted by the accumulated ceremony and constant scrutiny, subjected to endless well-wishing and good-natured teasing from every direction at once. Then, exactly as now, plenty of exhausted couples surely spent the actual peak of their own wedding celebration, quietly wishing that everyone would simply finally go home already, so that their actual married life together could genuinely begin at last. Yet even the grandest and most elaborate historical feast generally assumed one particular thing that we might today find genuinely strange: that a proper marriage specifically meant one husband paired with one wife. Because across enormous stretches of the wider world, marriage frequently came in considerably larger numbers than that. Part 18. When marriage meant more than two. Let's address directly an arrangement that genuinely surprises a great many people encountering this history for the first time. For enormous stretches of human history, across many different regions of the world, marriage simply didn't mean strictly two people joined together. Polygamy, most commonly taking the specific form of one man married simultaneously to multiple wives, appeared across numerous different cultures throughout history, frequently tied closely to considerations of wealth, social status, and a household's genuine practical ability to support a large number of dependents. It frequently functioned as a visible symbol of personal power and status within a given community. The more spouses a man successfully supported, generally speaking, the greater his overall social prestige. It was rarely a simple arrangement to actually manage in practice, of course, since successfully running multiple simultaneous marriages meant simultaneously managing multiple separate households, multiple sets of in-laws, and requiring a genuinely heroic amount of ongoing domestic diplomacy. Let's be entirely clear about the actual historical scale involved here, because this was never remotely some kind of marginal or fringe cultural practice. Across vast stretches of both history and geography, marriage involving multiple wives was widely accepted, entirely legal, and frequently genuinely prestigious within its own cultural context. It appeared across societies scattered all over the world, deeply woven directly into their respective laws, established customs, and religious traditions. Strict monogamy as the sole legitimate recognized form of marriage, the particular arrangement many people today simply assume represents the natural, universal human default, was, historically speaking, actually just one particular cultural tradition among several viable alternatives. Its eventual dominance across certain regions of the world resulted from very specific cultural and religious historical developments, rather than representing some kind of inevitable, biologically hardwired human default. The underlying logic behind polygamous arrangements was frequently economic in nature and directly tied to social and political power. Successfully supporting multiple wives, along with the numerous children they would collectively bear, required genuinely substantial accumulated wealth. That practical requirement meant only genuinely prosperous and powerful men could realistically afford multiple marriages, which naturally transformed the practice of maintaining multiple wives into a highly visible, tangible display of a man's overall status. A ruler or wealthy man supporting numerous wives was thereby demonstrating his considerable resources and social importance in about the most tangible way imaginable. The practice also served several genuinely practical purposes beyond simple status display. Producing large numbers of children helped secure a family lineage. Multiple separate marriages could forge multiple separate political alliances simultaneously, and the overall arrangement helped build a genuinely large, economically productive, combined household. For rulers especially, maintaining multiple marriages functioned as a genuine and effective tool of formal statecraft. A king might deliberately marry women drawn from several different important allied families or neighboring peoples, with each individual union sealing a separate alliance or meaningfully extending his overall political influence. In this particular sense, polygamy functioned essentially like the political marriages we discussed earlier in this story, only multiplied considerably across numerous simultaneous unions. A single powerful ruler could thereby bind himself formally to many different powerful families all at once, weaving together an extensive web of political connections that helped genuinely stabilize his overall reign. The wives involved in these particular arrangements frequently functioned primarily as instruments of formal diplomacy, their individual marriages serving political purposes that extended far beyond anything personal. But let's not pretend for even a moment that this kind of arrangement was genuinely simple to actually live within, because it emphatically was not. A household containing multiple wives represented a genuinely complex social organism, full of internal hierarchy, ongoing rivalry, and constant delicate negotiation between competing interests. There were persistent questions of relative rank among the various wives, active competition over limited household resources and personal attention, and above all, fierce ongoing concern regarding which particular wife's children would ultimately inherit the family's position and wealth. The genuine potential for jealousy, internal factional conflict, and open discord was consequently enormous. Successfully managing such a complex household demanded truly constant diplomatic skill, and the underlying tensions between rival wives and between their respective children could substantially shape, and in some documented historical cases, ultimately help destroy entire ruling dynasties. It's also worth noting that the considerably rarer reverse arrangement, one woman married simultaneously to multiple husbands, also existed historically in certain specific societies, usually arising from particular circumstances such as genuinely scarce available resources, or a deliberate cultural desire to keep family landholdings from becoming fragmented and divided among multiple competing brothers. This particular arrangement was never nearly as widespread as its far more common counterpart, but its documented historical existence serves as a useful reminder that human societies have experimented with marriage across considerably more diverse configurations than we might otherwise casually assume. Over time, various combined forces, religious, legal, and broader cultural, gradually pushed many different societies steadily toward monogamy as the singular required cultural norm. And across much of the modern world today, marriage involving multiple simultaneous spouses was eventually restricted significantly or banned outright by law. But for absolutely enormous portions of overall human history, spanning enormous portions of the wider world, a single marriage might genuinely include several spouses simultaneously. And remarkably, virtually nobody at the time found this particular arrangement remarkable in the slightest. Of course, regardless of the particular form any given marriage happened to take, the exact same difficult underlying question eventually arose within essentially every single one of them. What exactly do you do when the marriage itself genuinely goes wrong? And within Christian Europe specifically, the available answer had become genuinely, fiendishly complicated. Part 19. The annulment divorce's strange cousin. So what actually happened when a marriage went seriously wrong, at a time when the church had formally declared the underlying bond to be genuinely eternal? Things, predictably enough, got rather complicated. Across much of Christian Europe during this period, straightforward divorce had become nearly impossible to obtain through any legitimate legal channel. So those genuinely desperate to escape an unbearable marriage increasingly turned instead to the annulment, a formal legal and religious declaration stating that the marriage in question had, in fact, never truly and legally existed in the first place. This particular loophole produced some genuinely spectacularly creative legal arguments over the years, involving distant, previously unmentioned cousins, supposedly secret prior betrothal promises, and assorted other legal technicalities that nobody had apparently thought worth mentioning back at the original wedding. For the wealthy and genuinely powerful, pursuing an annulment represented a genuinely available, if expensive, escape hatch from an unwanted marriage. For absolutely everyone else, by stark contrast, an unhappy marriage was very often simply a life sentence to be quietly endured until one party or the other eventually had the good grace to die. Remember the underlying church doctrine at work here. A genuinely valid sacramental marriage, having been formally joined together by God Himself, simply could not be legitimately dissolved by any mere human authority. This effectively slammed the door completely shut on divorce in anything resembling the casual, straightforward manner the Romans had once practiced it. There was no longer any simple mechanism for two people to mutually agree to separate and subsequently marry someone else entirely. If your particular marriage was formally considered valid under church doctrine, you were consequently and genuinely stuck within it, Full stop, regardless of how miserable, cruel, or entirely loveless the relationship had gradually become over time. The underlying marital bond was understood to last for an entire lifetime, and that lifetime could, unfortunately, prove to be both very long and very genuinely unhappy in practice. The annulment represented the inevitable practical loophole this rigid religious system was bound to eventually produce. Since a genuinely valid marriage couldn't legitimately be dissolved once properly established, the only remaining viable escape route was to somehow prove instead that the marriage had never actually been genuinely valid to begin with, that some specific underlying flaw had rendered it invalid from its very inception, meaning that, in the formal eyes of the church, the couple involved had technically never actually been married at all in the first place. This particular loophole effectively transformed countless desperate spouses into frantic amateur investigators of their own original wedding ceremonies, hunting single-mindedly for any conceivable defect that might successfully unlock a legitimate exit from their current situation. One particularly popular avenue for pursuing an annulment involved claims of consanguinity, being too closely related by blood to have legitimately married in the first place. The church formally forbade marriage between relatives falling within certain specified degrees of relation, and these particular rules were broad and genuinely complicated enough that, with sufficiently determined genealogical digging, some previously overlooked inconvenient family connection could very often eventually be unearthed somewhere in the historical record. Suddenly, a couple who had already been married for many years might discover they were technically too closely related to have legitimately married in the first place, rendering the entire union formally void after the fact. The inconvenient fact that this exact same family relationship had been perfectly well known at the time of the original wedding, and objected to by absolutely nobody at that time, somehow became entirely irrelevant once a genuine exit was actively desired by one party. Other commonly cited grounds for pursuing an annulment included formal claims that one party had been forced into the original marriage against their genuine will, that some secret prior betrothal or previous marriage actually existed that hadn't been properly disclosed, or that the marriage in question had never actually been properly consummated in the physical sense. Each of these particular claims could, if successfully proven to the satisfaction of church authorities, mean the marriage had genuinely never truly taken legal or religious hold in the first place. The resulting legal arguments could occasionally become genuinely absurd, elaborate constructed narratives specifically designed to reach an already predetermined desired conclusion, with virtually everyone involved politely pretending the whole proceeding represented a sincere, good faith inquiry into the marriage's original validity, rather than what it frequently actually was, a well-funded quest for personal freedom from an unwanted marriage. And funding, notably, was very much the crucial deciding word here, because annulments were, in practical reality, realistically available primarily and almost exclusively to the genuinely wealthy and powerful. Successfully pursuing one required substantial money, considerable personal influence, skilled legal expertise, and very often direct personal connections reaching all the way up to the highest levels of the church hierarchy itself. A sufficiently powerful noble, or a reigning monarch with a sufficiently compelling political motive, could realistically marshal the considerable resources necessary to actually make an annulment happen in practice. An ordinary person trapped within a genuinely wretched marriage, by stark contrast, generally had no such realistic options available to them whatsoever. For them, this theoretical legal loophole might as well not have existed at all in any practical sense. They simply endured their situation, often for the remainder of their natural lives. This substantial gap between the genuinely powerful and everyone else represents one of the quieter, less discussed cruelties of this particular historical era. The exact same rigid religious rules that effectively condemned an ordinary peasant to an entire lifetime of documented misery within a bad marriage could, with sufficient expenditure, be creatively bent and reinterpreted for a reigning king who urgently needed to rearrange his political alliances. Marriage under this system was formally understood as eternal, unless, notably, you happen to possess sufficient wealth and influence to successfully prove, after the fact, that it had technically never genuinely happened at all. That single persistent tension between the theoretically unbreakable marriage bond and the very real, considerable practical power wielded by those determined to escape or reshape it would eventually help crack open the unified structure of Christianity itself. But before we properly reach that particular historical upheaval, we need to first examine what marriage actually did, in stark legal terms, to a woman's fundamental legal existence, because the honest answer turns out to be genuinely chilling. Part 20. Coverture, the legal disappearing ACT. Here we arrive at what amounts to a genuine legal horror story dressed up carefully as tradition, under a legal doctrine known as coverture, which shaped English common law and its many colonial offshoots for literally centuries. A married woman's entire legal identity became formally absorbed into her husband's. She could not, under this system, own property in her own individual name. She could not independently sign binding contracts. She could not legally retain her own personal earnings. In the eyes of the law itself, husband and wife were treated as a single unified legal person, and that single person was, quite conveniently for one party involved, the husband. A woman could go, in a single afternoon, from being recognized as an independent legal individual to becoming something closer to a legal ghost, the very moment she finished speaking her wedding vows. It wasn't really a partnership so much as an outright legal disappearing act. Let's walk carefully through exactly what this actually meant in practical daily terms, because the specific details here are genuinely stark. An unmarried woman, at least in formal legal principle, possessed certain recognized legal capacities of her own. She could own property outright, enter into binding contracts, and generally act as a recognized legal person in her own right, independent of any male relative. The moment she married under this system, the vast majority of those legal capacities simply vanished overnight. Her separate legal self was, in the specific formal language of the doctrine itself, considered covered entirely by her husband. The two individuals legally became one single unified person under the law, and there was genuinely no ambiguity whatsoever about which specific person that unified legal entity actually was. Her entirely separate legal existence was formally suspended for the complete duration of the marriage. The practical property consequences of this system were genuinely sweeping in scope. Whatever property or assets a woman brought into the marriage with her, and very often whatever she subsequently earned or independently acquired during the marriage itself, automatically came under her husband's direct legal control. Her personal property could become his outright property in a legal sense. Any wages she personally earned through her own labor were, legally speaking, considered his property to claim and use as he saw fit. She generally could not buy, sell, or independently manage property on her own, could not freely draft a personal will, and could not enter into contracts under her own individual name. A woman might work extraordinarily hard over many years and generate genuinely substantial personal income, and under the law as it then stood, that money simply belonged, in a formal legal sense, to her husband instead. Her economic independence didn't merely shrink under this system. It was, quite literally, legally erased entirely. This particular legal framework produced situations that appear almost genuinely surreal when viewed from any modern vantage point. A married woman generally could not sue another party, or be sued herself, under her own individual name, because she wasn't legally recognized as a fully separate person capable of standing alone in a court of law. Her husband typically had to be formally involved in any such legal proceeding on her behalf. In practical terms, This meant a wife possessed extraordinarily limited legal power to defend her own personal interests, pursue her own independent legal claims, or act independently within the broader legal system in any meaningful sense. She existed within the law almost entirely through her husband, functioning rather like a satellite with genuinely no independent orbit of her own. This entire doctrine rested on an underlying idea that was carefully presented, at the time, as being both perfectly natural and even genuinely harmonious. The notion that marriage united a couple so completely and thoroughly that they effectively became a single unified legal entity, with the husband serving naturally as its recognized head and formal legal representative. Framed carefully in this particular way, coverture could be plausibly presented as representing a kind of genuine unity rather than outright subjugation. But strip away the flattering official language, and the underlying practical reality remained perfectly plain. One partner in the marriage retained full legal personhood and complete practical control. The other partner was simply folded entirely into him, and thereby stripped of any genuinely independent legal standing whatsoever. Calling this arrangement unity didn't meaningfully change the underlying reality of exactly who actually held the power. The practical consequences for women trapped within genuinely unhappy marriages under this system were frequently severe. A wife married to a cruel or financially reckless husband might be forced to watch helplessly as he squandered property that had originally, in every meaningful sense, once been entirely her own, with genuinely little available legal recourse to prevent it. Successfully escaping such a marriage was already nearly impossible given the era's extremely restrictive divorce laws, and coverture ensured that, even while remaining formally within the marriage itself, she retained scant independent legal power to protect either herself or her own children. Her financial security, her practical ability to independently act, her very legal voice within society, all of it remained entirely bound up in the specific man she had married, for better, or far too often in documented practice, considerably for worse. Coverture endured as the prevailing legal standard for a remarkably long stretch of history, shaping the practical lived reality of countless women across many successive generations. It would ultimately require sustained organized struggle and gradual, incremental legal reform, stretched across a great many years, to finally restore married women's basic legal personhood and independent property rights. We'll return to that particular hard-fought struggle later in our overall story. For now, simply sit for a moment with the underlying reality. For centuries upon centuries, getting married could mean, quite literally, the effective legal disappearance of a woman as an independently recognized person in the formal eyes of the law itself. But the loss of formal legal identity wasn't, unfortunately, the only significant thing a wedding could expose a person to during this particular era. Because within the higher social circles of the time, even a couple's most intimate and private moment together was frequently treated as remarkably public business indeed. Part 21. The Wedding Night, a remarkably public-private affair. Let's carefully step into the bedroom now, because history, it turns out, was frankly considerably less private in this particular respect than most of us would probably prefer to imagine. For much of recorded history, particularly among royalty and the broader nobility, the wedding night itself wasn't understood as simply a personal, private matter between two newlyweds. It was widely treated instead as a genuine matter of significant public concern. Successfully producing a legitimate heir was frequently understood as the entire practical point of the marriage in the first place. So the physical consummation of the marriage could be surrounded by elaborate rituals, formal blessings, and, in certain well-documented cases, uncomfortably attentive witnesses lingering rather closer than modern sensibilities would generally consider appropriate. The couple's single most intimate private moment together was, in a very real practical sense, treated as official matter of state business. Try to imagine, for a moment, the sheer pressure inherent in a marriage where sexual success itself was measured, openly discussed, and in certain documented cases, quite literally supervised by other people who really, by any reasonable modern standard, ought to have simply left the room entirely. Here's the underlying, admittedly uncomfortable logic that drove this particular custom. A marriage, particularly one involving royalty or high nobility, wasn't considered fully and legally sealed until it had been properly physically consummated. An unconsummated marriage remained genuinely legally vulnerable under the prevailing legal and religious framework of the time. It could, under the right specific circumstances, potentially be formally challenged afterward, or even fully annulled outright on those specific grounds alone. So the wedding night itself wasn't understood as merely a romantic occasion. It represented, in a very real practical sense, the final essential load-bearing step that made the entire preceding marriage arrangement fully solid and legally unassailable. And because so much genuinely depended on this single specific outcome, political alliances, complex inheritance arrangements, the future of entire ruling dynasties, the families directly involved had a genuinely powerful practical interest in knowing, with complete certainty, that consummation had actually taken place as required. That particular underlying interest produced some genuinely mortifying customs when examined from a modern perspective. Within royal and high noble circles specifically, the newly married couple might be ceremonially escorted directly to the bedchamber by a substantial crowd of attendants and assembled family members. The marriage bed itself was, in certain documented traditions, formally blessed beforehand by a priest. Assembled guests would frequently linger nearby, joke loudly, and generally make merry immediately around the newlywed couple, who were expected to patiently endure this boisterous, rowdy send-off before finally, at long last, being left genuinely alone together. The abrupt transition from very public spectacle to genuinely private intimate moment was consequently jarring and thoroughly undignified by any modern standard, orchestrated throughout by people who plainly treated the entire proceeding as a legitimate communal event, rather than anything resembling a genuinely intimate personal moment between two people. In certain particularly extreme documented cases, especially where the underlying political stakes involved were highest, witnesses might actually remain present specifically to formally confirm that the marriage had indeed been properly consummated, or physical evidence might be actively sought and documented afterward as concrete proof. For a young bride and groom, who, remember, were very often near total strangers to one another, meeting for the first time under the genuinely crushing weight of substantial dynastic expectation. This represented about as far removed from any tender, private beginning to married life as it's realistically possible to imagine. The pressure involved was genuinely immense. The assembled audience was entirely real, and any perceived failure carried consequences that reached considerably further than mere personal embarrassment. This broader cultural obsession with obtaining definitive proof directly reflected the era's deep-seated anxieties surrounding questions of legitimacy. A future heir needed to be unquestionably established as the genuine product of the recognized marriage, because inheritance rights, formal succession to titles and lands, and the ultimate fate of substantial family fortunes all hinged directly on that single underlying fact being beyond any reasonable dispute. Any lingering doubt whatsoever about whether a marriage had been properly consummated, or whether a subsequently born child was genuinely legitimate, could potentially unleash genuine political chaos, contested inheritance disputes, formal challenges to established succession, even broader political crisis. So the wedding night was, quite literally, policed with a level of institutional seriousness that seems genuinely bizarre by modern standards, until you properly remember that entire kingdoms could realistically rise or fall based on the answer to that single specific question. For ordinary people, thankfully, the wedding night itself represented a considerably more genuinely private affair, though not always entirely free from the local community's own cheerful, persistent interference. Local peasant customs frequently involved the newly married couple being noisily seen off with plenty of ambient noise, playful teasing, and bawdy well-wishing before finally being left properly to themselves for the night. The local village didn't require the same kind of formal legal proof of consummation that a royal court demanded, but it certainly took a genuinely lively ongoing interest in the newlyweds regardless, and a fair amount of good-natured community harassment remained very much part of established local tradition. Genuine privacy, even for ordinary peasants, remained a fairly relative concept by modern standards. What ties all of this together as a coherent whole is the era's broader fundamental cultural attitude, that a marriage belonged, at least in significant part, to the surrounding community and to both families involved, rather than solely and exclusively to the couple themselves. The wedding night sat directly at the uncomfortable intersection between the single, most genuinely private human experience imaginable and the single most publicly significant institutional stakes conceivable, and history generally resolved that particular underlying tension firmly in favor of the public dimension. The now familiar modern idea that intimacy should belong entirely and exclusively to the couple's own private business represents, historically speaking, a fairly recent cultural luxury. But amid all of this cold, calculated concern surrounding heirs, inheritance, and formal legal proof, a genuinely strange and quietly revolutionary new idea was beginning to take root within European culture. The startling notion that romantic love itself might actually genuinely matter. And remarkably, this idea first arrived through poetry and expressed longing. Part 22. Courtly love, romance invented outside of marriage. Now here's where genuine feeling finally crashes directly into our story. Within medieval Europe, a genuinely curious cultural phenomenon began quietly blooming among the nobility, known to modern historians as courtly love, a highly idealized, frequently secret form of devotion typically expressed between a knight and a noble lady, full of longing, elaborate poetry, and dramatic theatrical sighing. Here's the genuine catch, though. This particular form of passionate romantic love typically had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with actual marriage. In fact, this entire passionate romantic ideal was frequently and quite deliberately imagined as existing entirely outside the institution of marriage, precisely because marriage itself was understood as fundamentally about duty and practical obligation, while love was understood as belonging to an entirely separate realm of dramatic personal experience. This represented the very first genuine cultural hint that perhaps, just perhaps, marriage and romantic love ought to have some meaningful connection to one another after all. Let's properly paint the picture here, because courtly love as a cultural phenomenon was genuinely, gloriously theatrical in practice. Imagine a knight utterly and completely devoted to a noble lady, very often one who happened to already be married to someone else entirely, and therefore thoroughly unattainable by design. His romantic love for her was expressed primarily through devoted service, elaborate poetry, grand dramatic gestures, and prolonged, genuinely exquisite personal suffering. He longed for her constantly. He pined openly. He composed elaborate verses celebrating her beauty and, somewhat paradoxically, her cruelty toward him. He performed brave deeds specifically in her honor. The entire affair was thoroughly drenched in unfulfilled yearning, and crucially, much of its cultural power derived precisely from the fact that it could rarely, if ever, actually be consummated or fulfilled. The longing itself was, in a very real sense, the entire point of the exercise. This particular cultural phenomenon flowered extensively within noble courts throughout Europe and found its primary artistic voice through the songs of traveling poets and musicians, who actively spread these idealized tales of devoted love across the broader noble world. Their songs and stories celebrated a particular kind of love that was refined, elevated, and almost explicitly spiritual in nature. A love that was understood to genuinely ennoble the devoted lover and make him a fundamentally better person through his sustained devotion. It functioned, in a very real sense, as romance transformed into a formal art form, governed by elaborate unwritten rules dictating precisely how a truly devoted lover should properly behave, suffer, and worship the specific object of his affection from a respectful distance. It was, in essence, romance reimagined as both a performance and a formal discipline. Now, here's the genuinely revealing part of this entire cultural phenomenon. The very existence of courtly love as a distinct, separate cultural concept tells us essentially everything we need to know about how medieval people genuinely viewed the institution of marriage itself. Romantic passion effectively had to be invented as something that happened specifically outside of marriage, precisely because marriage itself was so thoroughly understood by everyone involved as fundamentally a matter of duty, property, and political alliance that genuinely nobody realistically expected to encounter soaring romantic passion within it. Love and marriage were, in the medieval mind, treated as almost entirely separate cultural categories, one representing a practical social institution, the other representing a thrilling, genuinely dangerous, largely extramarital ideal. This particular cultural framework produced a genuinely fascinating contradiction sitting right at the heart of noble life during this period. A knight might be dutifully and formally married to a woman his family had carefully selected for entirely practical reasons, while simultaneously directing all of his genuine poetic passion towards some completely unattainable noble lady he adored from a respectful, deliberately agonized distance. His formal marriage handled the serious practical business of producing heirs and managing family estates. His courtly devotion, by contrast, handled all of his genuine emotional feelings. That these two fundamental aspects of a man's romantic life were expected, by everyone involved, to run along entirely separate parallel tracks reveals just how genuinely alien the now familiar modern concept of a loving, emotionally fulfilling marriage still remained during this particular era. We should be genuinely careful here not to treat every surviving tale of courtly love as a literal, accurate account of how real people actually behaved in practice. Much of this cultural material functioned primarily as literary idealism, an aspirational fantasy spun deliberately in songs and stories, rather than representing a precise, accurate description of typical real-world conduct. But cultural ideals genuinely do shape underlying reality over time, and this particular ideal planted something genuinely powerful within the broader cultural imagination of medieval Europe. It gave romantic love its own distinct language, its own cultural dignity, and a genuinely central place within contemporary art and literature. It made romantic passion something actively worth celebrating and pursuing in its own right, even if, for the time being, that passion remained carefully quarantined safely away from the actual marriage bed itself. And that, quietly, represented the very first genuine crack in the wall. Once a broader culture had genuinely learned to celebrate romantic love this intensely, even when explicitly located outside the bounds of marriage, the underlying idea would ultimately prove impossible to fully contain within those original boundaries forever. Slowly, gradually, across several subsequent centuries, the prevailing cultural notion would drift steadily toward what had previously seemed an almost genuinely unthinkable question. What if the specific person you happen to marry could also, simultaneously, be the specific person you genuinely loved? But before romantic love could complete its long, gradual march directly into the heart of marriage itself, a genuine religious earthquake was about to shake the entire established institution to its very foundations, fundamentally changing the underlying rules across roughly half of the European continent. Part 23. The Reformation shakes the foundations. Let's talk now about genuine upheaval, because when the Protestant Reformation formally split European Christianity into competing factions, it inevitably took the institution of marriage along for the resulting ride. Protestant religious reformers explicitly rejected the established Catholic idea of marriage as a formal sacrament, choosing instead to reframe it as an honorable earthly institution rather than as a holy, divinely ordained mystery. This seemingly subtle theological shift carried genuinely enormous practical consequences. In certain regions, it made the previously unthinkable prospect of divorce conceivable once again. It fundamentally altered exactly who held legal control over marriage law, and it gradually changed how ordinary married couples themselves came to understand their own union. One particularly famous religious reformer, notably, went on to marry a former nun himself, thoroughly scandalizing polite society at the time, and, in doing so, quietly making the broader point that even ordained clergy could legitimately marry after all. Marriage itself was gradually becoming a matter increasingly governed by the state and by individual personal conscience, rather than remaining exclusively the domain of the church altar. Recall the towering historical significance of marriage having been formally declared a sacrament under Catholic doctrine. As a recognized sacrament, marriage was understood as a sacred channel of divine grace, formally joined together by God Himself, and consequently entirely impossible for mere mortal humans to legitimately dissolve afterward. That single powerful theological idea had effectively locked much of Europe into a system of lifelong, genuinely unbreakable marriages for many preceding centuries. When Protestant reformers directly challenged this established sacramental view of marriage, they weren't merely quibbling over abstract theological technicalities for their own sake. They were, in a very real sense, pulling out a genuinely load-bearing structural beam from beneath the entire existing system. If marriage was properly understood as an honorable human institution rather than as an indissoluble divine mystery, then the entire underlying logic that had rendered divorce essentially impossible for centuries began, for the first time in a very long while, to genuinely wobble. This theological shift didn't unleash easy, casual divorce overnight by any means. The Protestant reformers themselves remained, on the whole, deeply serious about the fundamental importance and intended permanence of marriage as an institution. But it did genuinely crack the previously sealed door open, if only slightly. Within various Protestant regions across Europe, divorce gradually became conceivable under certain sufficiently grave circumstances, in ways it simply hadn't been previously under strict Catholic doctrine. The previously absolute, no exceptions permanence of the sacramental marital bond gave way, in certain specific places, to a somewhat more genuinely flexible underlying understanding. It represented, admittedly, a fairly modest shift in actual day-to-day practice, but a genuinely profound shift in underlying legal and theological principle. The basic idea that a marriage might, under certain specific conditions, be genuinely and legitimately ended had formally returned to mainstream Western religious and legal thought after a very long absence. The Protestant reformers also, somewhat paradoxically, elevated the status of marriage itself in a genuinely surprising way, even while simultaneously demoting it formally from its previous status as a sacrament. By explicitly rejecting the established Catholic idea that celibacy and dedicated monastic religious life represented a spiritually superior path to God, they effectively elevated ordinary married life to the status of a genuinely good and honorable calling in its own right. Marriage and family life were no longer framed as merely a lesser spiritual path reserved for those who couldn't successfully manage strict religious celibacy. They were reframed instead as a worthy, even genuinely blessed way to live one's entire life. This particular theological shift helped move the broader cultural understanding of marriage toward being seen as a genuinely positive partnership, and a central, valued part of a good and fulfilling life, rather than remaining merely a grudging concession to unavoidable human weakness. And then there was the specific matter of clergy actually marrying, which proved genuinely explosive within the broader religious politics of the time. Informally rejecting the established Catholic doctrine of mandatory clerical celibacy, Protestant reformers directly opened the way for ordained priests and other religious figures to legitimately marry for the first time. When one particularly prominent reformer, himself a former monk, went on to formally marry a woman who had herself left convent religious life, it functioned as a deliberate, deeply scandalous public statement at the time. It declared, in about as personal and direct terms as imaginable, that marriage was genuinely honorable for absolutely everyone, ordained clergy specifically included, and that the traditional Catholic vows of celibacy hadn't actually represented the spiritually superior calling they had long been claimed to be. The resulting public gossip at the time was genuinely tremendous, but the underlying theological message being communicated was entirely serious and deliberately intended. Perhaps the single most lasting practical consequence of the entire Reformation, in terms of marriage specifically, was the gradual, ongoing shift in exactly who held meaningful control over the institution. As marriage was steadily reframed across Protestant Europe as fundamentally an earthly human institution, rather than an exclusively religious one, secular civil authorities increasingly began taking a direct, active hand in formally regulating it. Over time, government and civil authority grew steadily more involved in defining, licensing, and formally overseeing marriage as a legal institution, representing a slow but genuinely significant migration of underlying authority away from the church hierarchy and towards secular civil government instead. This gradual shift laid essential groundwork for the eventual, now entirely familiar modern idea of marriage as something the state formally records, actively regulates, and in many jurisdictions today, directly performs through licensed civil officials. The broader religious landscape of Europe was now, following the Reformation, genuinely and permanently divided. And the established rules governing marriage were consequently divided right along with it. Different regions of Europe now operated under different dominant religious faiths, and consequently under meaningfully different legal frameworks governing marriage. The single unified religious system that had previously governed marriage practice across the entire continent was now genuinely gone for good, replaced instead by contested ground actively shaped by individual conscience, regional politics, and competing claims to underlying authority in new and considerably more complicated ways than before. And as various European colonial powers subsequently carried their own competing, region-specific ideas about proper marriage practice across the world's oceans to distant lands, those particular ideas would go on to collide violently, and with genuinely lasting consequences, with the existing marriage customs of peoples living all across the wider world. Part 24. Empire and Marriage, when CULTURES. As European colonial powers steadily expanded their reach across the globe over subsequent centuries, they inevitably carried their own particular marriage customs along with them, and those customs collided head-on with the existing marriage practices of virtually every other culture they encountered. These colonial encounters brought fundamentally clashing ideas regarding exactly who could legitimately marry whom, what actually counted as a genuine, recognized union, and whose long-established traditions were considered legally and morally legitimate in the first place. Existing marriage practices within a great many colonized societies were routinely dismissed outright, forcibly regulated, or aggressively reshaped to conform to European expectations. Marriage, under these circumstances, became a genuine tool of political control, every bit as much as it remained an expression of love or family strategy. It's a genuinely sobering reminder that the seemingly straightforward question of exactly who gets to marry has, throughout much of history, been anything but simple, and has all too rarely been left entirely to the couple themselves to decide. Consider carefully what actually happened whenever one culture's established marriage customs collided directly with another's entirely different system. European colonizers typically arrived in newly encountered territories carrying firm, often deeply religiously grounded convictions about exactly what a legitimate marriage genuinely was: monogamous by definition, formally sanctioned by the church, permanent in nature, and structured according to a very particular predetermined pattern. They subsequently encountered societies scattered all across the world that had developed their own long-established, entirely internally coherent marriage systems. Systems featuring different ceremonial traditions, different established rules regarding multiple spouses, and fundamentally different underlying understandings of exactly what bound a couple together, and what circumstances could legitimately dissolve that bond. Rather than treating these diverse existing systems as equally valid on their own cultural terms, colonial authorities quite frequently dismissed them outright as improper, insufficiently civilized, or simply not genuine marriages at all in any meaningful legal sense. This particular pattern of dismissal carried genuinely real and frequently devastating practical consequences for the people directly affected. When a colonizing power formally refused to recognize existing local marriages as legally valid, it could effectively strip entire communities of established rights, inheritance claims, and basic legal legitimacy in a single administrative stroke. Unions that had been considered entirely valid and properly established within their own original cultural context were suddenly deemed formally non-existent under the newly imposed colonial legal system, throwing long-standing questions surrounding property rights, children's legal status, and overall family standing into genuine administrative chaos. The underlying power to formally determine exactly what counted as a legitimate marriage was, in effect, the power to fundamentally reshape entire societies from the outside, and colonial authorities wielded that particular power accordingly, often with devastating long-term consequences for the affected populations. Marriage also became, across various different colonial settings, a genuinely effective tool for actively drawing and rigidly enforcing social boundaries between different population groups. Colonial legal codes frequently governed, and often deliberately restricted, marriages taking place between members of different population groups, using marriage law as a direct instrument for maintaining rigid social hierarchies and reinforcing deep social divisions between groups. The fundamental question of exactly who was formally permitted to marry whom became, under these colonial systems, a matter of formal law backed by genuine coercive force, specifically designed to help preserve whatever particular social order the colonizing power wished to impose on the territory. Marriage, that supposedly deeply personal bond between two individuals, was thereby actively pressed into service as a deliberate instrument of broader social and political control. At the very same time, colonial powers frequently worked quite actively to deliberately reshape the existing marriage customs of the various peoples they now ruled over, either pressuring or, in many cases, directly compelling local populations to formally adopt the colonizers' own preferred marriage forms instead. Existing practices such as polygamous marriage were frequently and specifically targeted for active suppression under colonial law, while the colonizers' own preferred model of a proper, monogamous marriage was actively promoted, or in many documented cases directly imposed by force of law, as representing the singular, civilized standard to which all colonized populations should now conform. This represented genuine cultural transformation, actively enforced from above by an occupying power, forcibly remaking deeply intimate aspects of daily life to conform to entirely foreign cultural expectations. The resulting effects rippled outward across multiple subsequent generations, actively disrupting established traditions that had, in many documented cases, successfully endured for many centuries prior to colonial contact. It's genuinely worth pausing here to properly sit with just how strange and how deeply consequential all of this actually was. Marriage, which we might otherwise naturally imagine as representing about the most intensely personal of all human arrangements, became, under these specific historical circumstances, an active frontier of contested political power within the broader collision of competing empires and peoples. The underlying rules governing marriage were set, in these colonial contexts, not by the couples directly involved themselves, but rather by distant colonial authorities pursuing their own separate political and economic agendas. And those externally imposed rules could grant, or just as easily deny, formal recognition, legal rights, and basic social legitimacy to literally millions of affected people across the colonized world. The seemingly simple underlying question, is this a genuinely real marriage, turned out, in this particular historical context, to carry enormous practical weight. And the ultimate answer was, all too often, dictated entirely by whichever party happened to hold the greater underlying power in that specific colonial relationship. This particular chapter within our broader story is considerably less about romance than it is about how thoroughly the institution of marriage has, throughout virtually all of recorded human history, remained deeply entangled with questions of power, formal law, and active social control. Far from ever being a purely private personal matter, marriage has repeatedly functioned as a genuine battlefield upon which considerably larger political and economic forces have fought over the fundamental shape of society itself. The intimate and the openly political have, historically speaking, never really been quite as cleanly separated from one another as we might otherwise like to comfortably imagine today. Yet even amid all of this active colonial control and cultural imposition happening abroad, back within Europe itself, a considerably softer, and in many ways genuinely stranger, cultural transformation was quietly underway. One that would go on to wrap the institution of marriage in more accumulated sentiment and correspondingly higher personal expectations than any preceding era in this entire story. Part 25. The Victorians and the Sacred, Suffocating Ideal. Enter the Victorians, who took the institution of marriage and thoroughly wrapped it in so much accumulated sentiment that it could genuinely barely breathe under the weight. Throughout the 19th century, a genuinely powerful new cultural ideal steadily took hold across much of the Western world, marriage reimagined as a sacred, loving personal refuge, complete with a devoted wife serving as its established moral and emotional center. It certainly sounded genuinely lovely printed on a greeting card. In actual practical reality, this particular ideal locked a great many women into a genuinely narrow prescribed social role, while simultaneously establishing impossibly lofty emotional expectations for virtually every marriage. The Victorians publicly celebrated pure, romantic, explicitly lifelong devotion between spouses, all while privately continuing to navigate essentially all the same affairs, personal unhappiness, and quiet disappointment that every preceding generation had also privately experienced. They certainly didn't invent the basic concept of marrying primarily for love, but they proved genuinely, exceptionally skilled at publicly presenting themselves as though they somehow had. The core Victorian ideal centered around a genuinely sharp division of gender roles within marriage, a division that was publicly presented at the time as being entirely natural, morally correct, and even genuinely beautiful. The husband properly belonged to the harsh, demanding outside world of paid work and active public life. The wife, by contrast, properly belonged to the home itself, which was culturally imagined as a serene, protected sanctuary specifically shielded from that outside harshness. She was expected to serve as the moral and emotional heart of the entire household, nurturing, morally pure, and thoroughly devoted, actively presiding over a domestic haven where her husband could reliably retreat from the world's various brutalities each evening. It represented a genuinely influential cultural vision of marriage as a tender personal refuge. It was also, for the women actually living within it, functionally, a beautifully gilded cage. This particular exalted domestic role came attached with genuinely severe practical restrictions. The idealized Victorian wife's entire recognized sphere of activity was the home itself, her fundamental life purpose defined almost entirely by devoted service to her husband and children. Her overall personal worth was measured primarily by her demonstrated moral goodness, her practical domestic skill, and her consistently selfless service to her family. Any personal ambitions extending meaningfully beyond the household were actively discouraged or dismissed outright as somehow fundamentally unnatural for a woman. The elevated pedestal the Victorians had carefully constructed for wives was genuinely real in cultural terms. But a pedestal, by its very nature, represents an extremely small and confining place to actually stand for an entire lifetime, and it left remarkably little genuine room for a woman to develop and express herself as a full, independent human being. The Victorians also poured genuinely enormous accumulated sentiment into the broader romance surrounding marriage itself as a cultural institution. This particular era featured genuinely elaborate courtship rituals, deeply heartfelt personal love letters, and a rich, extensive surrounding culture of romantic feeling, wrapped specifically around weddings and the broader experience of married life. The now iconic white wedding, with its established imagery of bridal purity and its considerable emphasis on the deep emotional significance of the marital union, gained enormous lasting cultural power specifically during this particular era, directly shaping wedding traditions that continue to endure right up through the present day. Marriage itself was actively celebrated throughout Victorian popular culture as the sacred union of genuinely loving hearts, elaborately wrapped in flowers, heartfelt sentiment, and considerable moral seriousness. But there existed, in practice, a genuinely vast gap between this carefully cultivated public ideal and the messier underlying reality, and the Victorians proved to be genuine masters at simply not looking too closely at that particular gap. Beneath the carefully polished sentimental surface, real Victorian marriages continued to struggle with essentially all of the same ordinary human problems that no amount of cultural idealization could ever fully banish. There were genuinely unhappy unions. There were unfaithful spouses. There were cold, fundamentally loveless households. And there were countless women effectively trapped in genuinely miserable domestic circumstances with remarkably little practical power available to escape them. The vigorous public celebration of pure, devoted marital love coexisted throughout this entire era, alongside a considerably more private world containing essentially the same disappointments and personal failures humanity had always quietly experienced. Respectability, as a governing social value, demanded that these private failures be kept firmly and carefully out of public sight. The sheer accumulated pressure generated by this idealized cultural standard could itself prove genuinely crushing to live under. When marriage is culturally presented as supposed to be a sacred, loving, essentially morally perfect personal refuge, the entirely ordinary friction and disappointment inherent in any real married life inevitably become experienced as genuine sources of personal shame and perceived failure. Couples who couldn't quite manage to achieve this glowing cultural ideal very often suffered quietly and privately, carefully maintaining respectable public appearances, while privately falling considerably short of expectations that were, frankly, essentially impossible for any real human relationship to fully meet. The higher a cultural ideal is deliberately raised, the further there consequently remains to fall, and correspondingly, the more private energy gets devoted to carefully concealing that particular fall from public view. Still, for all of its considerable hypocrisy and its very real cruelties, the Victorian era genuinely succeeded in cementing something culturally important and lasting. The now deep-seated cultural expectation that marriage should, at its core, be genuinely rooted in love and sustained emotional devotion between spouses. That particular expectation, however imperfectly it was actually realized in day-to-day Victorian practice, was steadily becoming genuinely central to how ordinary people across the Western world understood the entire institution of marriage going forward. And meanwhile, considerably removed from the carefully curated Victorian parlor, the roaring noise of new factories and the accelerating churn of a rapidly modernizing economy were quietly, steadily dismantling the older economic foundations of marriage in ways that most Victorians themselves barely even noticed happening around them. Part 26. The Industrial Revolution quietly rewrites the rules. Let's follow the rising factory smoke now, because the Industrial Revolution quietly transformed the underlying institution of marriage from the inside out, even as most contemporaries remained focused on other, more visible changes happening around them. As increasing numbers of people steadily left traditional family farms for rapidly growing industrial cities, and as regular cash wages gradually replaced inherited land as the primary practical source of individual economic survival, the old established logic of marrying primarily for property and available labor began, for the first time in centuries, to genuinely loosen its grip. Young industrial workers earning their own independent wages, and frequently now living considerably farther away from direct parental oversight than any previous generation, gained access to something genuinely revolutionary in historical terms: meaningful personal choice. For essentially the first time in recorded history, ordinary working people could increasingly select their own marriage partners directly, rather than simply accepting whatever arrangement their families had negotiated on their behalf. It wasn't, admittedly, complete personal freedom in any absolute sense, but it represented a genuine, meaningful crack in a very old door, and romantic love began steadily slipping through that crack in gradually increasing numbers. Think carefully about how the older established system had actually functioned, and precisely why it had managed to hold together for so many preceding centuries. For most of recorded human history, basic individual survival had depended almost entirely on access to land and on one's broader extended family network. You genuinely needed your family's accumulated resources, your family's inherited plot of land, and your family's active approval and support, because without all of that combined backing, you effectively had nothing to fall back on. That fundamental economic dependence gave families enormous practical power and leverage over their children's marriage choices. Families directly controlled the essential underlying assets, and consequently, they directly controlled who their children were permitted to marry. A young person genuinely couldn't simply strike out entirely on their own and marry purely as they personally pleased, because doing so alone would very likely have meant genuine economic ruin or even starvation. The entire traditional arranged, property-driven marriage system rested fundamentally on this deep underlying economic dependence. The Industrial Revolution began steadily dissolving that long-standing economic foundation, piece by piece, over the course of several generations. As new factories rose across the landscape and rapidly industrializing cities swelled dramatically in population, growing numbers of people left the traditional countryside and the family farm behind entirely, to instead work for regular cash wages within these new industrial settings. A young worker employed within a growing industrial city earned genuinely independent money of their own, entirely separate from inherited family land, and frequently now lived physically quite far removed from direct parental supervision and oversight. That regular wage, however genuinely modest it often was in practice, represented a genuinely quiet economic revolution. It meant that a young person could now, at least in principle, realistically support themselves without depending entirely on their family's accumulated resources for basic survival. And that fundamental shift meaningfully changed the underlying balance of power over their own personal life choices, including, crucially, the question of exactly whom they might eventually choose to marry. Alongside this new economic independence came the gradual, admittedly uneven expansion of genuine personal choice in matters of marriage. Young people meeting one another within the mixed, bustling social environment of the growing industrial city, in workplaces, in newly diverse urban neighborhoods, at various social gatherings, increasingly began forming their own personal romantic attachments and making their own independent decisions regarding marriage. Parental control over these decisions gradually loosened its grip as the underlying economic leverage that had previously enforced that control steadily weakened over time. This parental influence didn't simply vanish overnight by any means, and family opinion certainly continued to matter enormously in practice throughout this transitional period. But the previously near-absolute necessity of accepting whatever arranged match one's family had negotiated, purely for the sake of basic economic survival, was gradually easing across successive generations. Genuinely, choosing one's own marriage partner was steadily becoming a realistic practical possibility for increasing numbers of ordinary working people. This significant economic and social shift dovetailed quite powerfully with the broader cultural celebration of romantic love that had already been steadily building across preceding centuries, as we've traced throughout this story. Just as ordinary people were gaining genuinely greater practical freedom to independently choose their own marriage partners, the surrounding broader culture was simultaneously insisting, with increasing cultural force, that love itself should properly serve as the fundamental basis for any legitimate marriage. These two separate historical developments powerfully reinforced one another as they unfolded together. The underlying economic conditions made genuinely choosing a partner based on love practically feasible for the first time, while the broader prevailing cultural ideals simultaneously made choosing for love an increasingly expected social norm. Slowly but steadily, the love match was shifting, within Western culture, from a somewhat dangerous romantic fantasy into a genuinely realistic, even increasingly normal way for ordinary people to get married. The rapidly industrializing world also reshaped the underlying institution of marriage in considerably harsher ways too, and we certainly shouldn't romanticize this particular historical transition. Working-class families during this period frequently endured genuinely brutal daily conditions, grueling physical labor, desperate ongoing poverty, and severe economic strain that placed enormous pressure on countless marriages. The increasing physical separation between paid workplace and domestic home life hardened, within many households, the emerging division between a wage-earning husband and a home-keeping wife, while in a great many other households, women and even young children were forced by sheer economic necessity to labor within the factories alongside adult men. This broader social upheaval was genuinely profound, and it frequently proved deeply painful for those living through it, tearing apart older established patterns of family life without always gently or adequately replacing them with something equally supportive. But through absolutely all of this considerable social disruption and upheaval, one fundamental underlying shift was steadily and irreversibly taking hold. The ancient, deeply entrenched link between marriage and family-controlled inherited property was genuinely weakening for the first time in recorded history. And in its place, there steadily grew the increasingly realistic possibility of marriage as a genuine personal choice, freely made by two independent individuals acting largely on their own behalf. The old economic ground that had long supported the traditional arranged marriage system was genuinely shifting beneath everyone's feet, and marriage itself was slowly but steadily being set loose from constraints that had effectively bound the institution for many preceding millennia. All of which, taken together, set the essential stage for what may well represent the single most dramatic transformation in this entire 5,000-year story. The historic moment when romantic love stopped being merely a fortunate accidental bonus, and instead became the primary, explicitly stated reason people chose to marry at all. Part 27. The moment love became the whole point. Here, finally, is the genuine turning point our entire story has been quietly building toward from the very beginning. Gradually, across the 18th and 19th centuries, and accelerating decisively through the 20th, a genuinely new cultural idea steadily took hold across much of the Western world. The notion that people should marry primarily because they personally wanted to, because they genuinely loved one another, because their own hearts had told them so. The companionate marriage, a partnership built explicitly on mutual affection, shared friendship, and genuine personal respect between equals, became the new dominant cultural ideal. It sounds, to modern ears, almost embarrassingly obvious, but it represented a genuinely radical departure from essentially everything that had come before it in this story. For literally thousands of years, marriage had been fundamentally organized around survival, political alliance, and property. Now, quite suddenly in historical terms, it was expected to deliver something considerably more elusive: personal happiness, a standard so demanding that it quietly guaranteed a great deal of future disappointment for a great many people. Pause here and genuinely appreciate just how enormous this particular shift actually was. For essentially the entirety of the history we've covered tonight, the clay contracts pressed by Mesopotamian scribes, the livestock exchanged as bride price, the carefully negotiated political alliances between royal houses, the arranged childhood betrothals, romantic love had, at absolute best, been treated as a fortunate accident that might, with luck, develop gradually sometime after the wedding had already taken place. The actual underlying purpose of marriage lay somewhere else entirely: in basic survival, in property and inheritance, in family political strategy, in producing legitimate heirs. The now familiar notion that you should choose your own spouse primarily based on your personal feelings, that romantic love itself should form the very foundation of the entire arrangement, would have struck most of your own ancestors as genuinely reckless, even outright dangerous. And yet, remarkably, that particular idea eventually arrived, and it ultimately won out almost completely. The specific cultural ideal that emerged from this shift was the companionate marriage, the vision of husband and wife functioning as genuinely loving companions, equal partners bound together by mutual affection, deep respect, and a fully shared emotional life. Marriage was reimagined within this new framework, not primarily as an economic transaction or a dynastic political arrangement, but instead as an intimate personal partnership specifically meant to provide love, close friendship, and genuine personal fulfillment to both parties involved. Your chosen spouse was now expected to be your very closest companion, the specific person who genuinely made you happy, the individual you had freely chosen yourself, and would go on to cherish for a lifetime. This particular idea is so thoroughly familiar to us today that its genuinely radical historical novelty is remarkably easy to overlook entirely. But it authentically appended several thousand years of deeply held cultural assumptions about what marriage was fundamentally for. Several distinct historical forces converged together to make this particular transformation genuinely possible. The economic changes we traced in the previous section had already loosened traditional family control and given individuals considerably greater practical freedom to choose their own partners. The broader cultural celebration of romantic love, which had been steadily building for centuries and had fully blossomed within the sentimental atmosphere of the Victorian era, had made love the increasingly expected foundation for any legitimate marriage. growing philosophical ideas about individual personal happiness and self-fulfillment further encouraged ordinary people to actively seek out marriages capable of satisfying their own hearts, rather than simply serving their extended family's practical interests. Taken together, these several converging currents carried the love match steadily forward, transforming it from a genuinely radical fringe notion into the reigning dominant cultural ideal across much of the Western world. But here's the significant catch quietly buried inside this apparent triumph, and it's a genuinely substantial one. When you fundamentally redefine marriage as being primarily about love and personal happiness, you simultaneously make the entire institution considerably more fragile than it had ever been before. A marriage historically built primarily around property and inherited duty could reliably endure regardless of the couple's actual day-to-day feelings, precisely because feeling had never really been its central defining purpose in the first place. A marriage newly built primarily around romantic love, by contrast, now had to actually and continuously deliver genuine love in order to justify its own continued existence. When the original affection inevitably faded, or when the expected personal happiness simply ran dry over time, the marriage's entire underlying reason for existing came into serious question. The love match had dramatically raised the emotional stakes involved in marriage, and in doing precisely that, it had quietly planted the essential seeds of a genuinely modern expectation. The idea that a marriage which no longer reliably delivers happiness might, quite reasonably, deserve to be ended. The overall expectations placed on marriage swelled to genuinely remarkable proportions as this new ideal took hold. Your chosen spouse was now expected, all at once, to be your passionate lover, your closest best friend, your primary emotional support system, your intellectual equal and companion, your dedicated partner in absolutely every meaningful sense of that word. A single human relationship was now expected to fully satisfy an enormous range of deep personal needs that earlier historical eras had typically spread out across an entire surrounding community of family, friends, and neighbors. It represents, undeniably, a genuinely beautiful cultural ideal, and also an almost impossibly demanding one in daily practice. Asking any single relationship to reliably carry that much accumulated emotional weight was, perhaps inevitably, bound to place real strain on it, and the resulting personal disappointment whenever a marriage fell short of this lofty standard was correspondingly deep and painful. Still, this broader cultural transformation was, in most meaningful respects, genuinely profound and often authentically liberating for the people living through it. Ordinary people were, for the first time in recorded history, increasingly free to marry those they genuinely loved and had personally and freely chosen, which represented a real and genuinely precious human gain, whatever its accompanying costs. But this significant new personal freedom, and these correspondingly new and elevated expectations, would very soon require a companion historical development of their own. Because if marriage was now fundamentally about love and personal happiness, ordinary people would eventually need a genuinely accessible, realistic way out of the marriage, whenever that essential love had, in fact, disappeared entirely. Part 28. RECLAMING, a legal self, the slow dismantling of coverture. Let's talk now about a considerably slower, considerably harder-won revolution that unfolded quietly within marriage itself, over the course of many decades. Across the 19th and 20th centuries, determined legal reformers and activists fought steadily to restore to married women, essentially everything the old doctrine of coverture had originally taken away from them. The fundamental legal right to independently own property, to keep and control their own personal earnings, and to genuinely exist as complete, independent legal individuals in the eyes of the law. Little by little, through sustained campaigning and gradual legislative reform, the relevant laws steadily changed across one jurisdiction after another. A married woman was, at long last, no longer legally absorbed entirely into her husband's separate legal identity. She was, finally, formally recognized as a complete legal person in her own right. This particular historical shift wasn't merely about abstract property law in isolation. It fundamentally reshaped the entire underlying balance of power within marriage as an institution, gradually transforming a legal relationship, originally built on outright ownership, into something that could, at least under the law, genuinely begin to resemble an authentic partnership between two legal equals. Recall the genuinely grim underlying reality of coverture that we examined earlier in this story. The doctrine under which a married woman's separate legal identity essentially vanished entirely into her husband's, systematically stripping her of the practical ability to independently own property, keep her own hard-earned wages, or act independently within any recognized legal system. This particular legal system had endured, largely unchallenged, for many preceding centuries, and consequently, successfully dismantling it proved to be neither quick nor genuinely easy to achieve in practice. It required sustained, determined organizing effort, persistent political campaigning across multiple generations, and gradual, incremental legal reform stretched out across many decades. The basic legal rights that a great many people today simply take entirely for granted were won only gradually, piece by painstaking piece, through the sustained, determined work of activists who consistently insisted that marriage should never be permitted to legally erase a woman as an independent person. The specific property law reforms achieved during this period proved genuinely foundational to everything that followed. Over time, new laws were successfully passed across various jurisdictions that finally allowed married women to legally own property under their own individual names, to keep and independently control the wages they personally earned through their own labor, rather than automatically surrendering that income to their husbands, and to independently manage their own personal assets without requiring a husband's formal consent. This particular legal change might sound, on its surface, like fairly dry administrative housekeeping, but its practical effect on countless real individual lives was genuinely enormous. A woman who could now legally own property and independently keep her own earnings possessed a genuine measure of practical independence and personal security that coverture had previously denied her entirely. She was, for the first time under the law, no longer economically dissolved entirely into her husband's separate legal identity. She now possessed a genuine legal and financial existence entirely of her own, independent of any man. These significant legal changes rippled steadily outward into essentially every corner of ordinary married life over subsequent decades. A wife who now possessed genuine legal personhood could increasingly enter into contracts independently, control her own personal financial affairs, and stand within the broader legal system as a recognized individual, rather than existing merely as a legal appendage of her husband. Her practical ability to protect herself, her children, and her own personal interests grew correspondingly stronger as these reforms took hold. The fundamental marriage relationship itself began to shift, however gradually and unevenly, away from a relationship fundamentally organized around legal ownership, and towards something that could genuinely aspire to be an authentic partnership between two people who both retained their own independent legal standing. The husband was, for the first time in centuries, no longer the sole recognized legal person within the marriage itself. This particular legal transformation formed part of a considerably broader social and political movement for expanded women's rights and social standing that reshaped Western society more generally over roughly the same historical period. As women more broadly gained expanded legal rights and practical opportunities across the wider world, in education, in employment, in political participation, the fundamental terms of marriage inevitably shifted correspondingly as well. A marriage genuinely conducted between two fully recognized legal individuals was, in every meaningful sense, a fundamentally different kind of institution than one conducted between a full legal person and his legally absorbed, dependent wife. The older established model of the wife as her husband's legal dependent, defined entirely and exclusively through her relationship to him, was steadily giving way to something genuinely new, even though this broader transformation remained gradual, uneven, and by no means fully complete even by the 20th century's end. It's genuinely worth emphasizing here just how long and difficult this particular struggle actually proved to be in practice, because its sheer difficulty reveals just how deeply entrenched the older coverture system had genuinely become over the preceding centuries. Successfully restoring married women's basic legal personhood required overturning many centuries' worth of established law and deeply ingrained custom that had previously treated female legal subordination within marriage as being both entirely natural and genuinely proper. Meaningful progress arrived only in incremental stages, frequently against genuinely fierce organized resistance. And the broader ongoing work of achieving authentic legal equality within marriage extended across a great many subsequent decades, continuing in various forms well into the 20th century and beyond. Each individual legal reform achieved built carefully upon the last one, slowly and steadily reconstructing the entire institution of marriage from a fundamental relationship of legal ownership into something that could genuinely aspire toward equal partnership. The practical consequences of these reforms reached deep into the emotional heart of marriage as an institution as well. The companionate ideal of genuinely loving equal partners made considerably more coherent sense once both partners within a marriage were actually and fully recognized as complete, independent legal individuals in their own right. Genuine love shared between legal equals is, after all, a rather fundamentally different thing from mere devotion offered between a legal owner and the person legally owned by him. As women steadily reclaimed their basic legal personhood through decades of sustained reform, the now modern vision of marriage as an authentic partnership between two genuinely whole, independent people became, gradually, not merely an abstract aspirational ideal, but an increasingly achievable practical reality for a growing number of couples. And once marriage had genuinely become a freely chosen partnership between two independent individuals marrying primarily for love, the final logical piece of this entire historical puzzle fell naturally into place. What remained necessary was a genuinely accessible, realistic way to formally end a marriage whenever the underlying love that had originally justified it had, for whatever reason, genuinely disappeared. Part 29. No-fault divorce and the right to walk away. Now that ordinary people were genuinely marrying primarily for love, an entirely new practical problem inevitably emerged. What exactly happens when that original love eventually runs out? For essentially all of preceding recorded history, successfully escaping an unwanted marriage had remained nearly impossible for the overwhelming majority of ordinary people. But the 20th century changed this fundamental reality quite dramatically. Divorce laws across many different countries gradually loosened over successive decades, culminating eventually in the historic arrival of what became known as no-fault divorce, a genuinely transformative legal innovation meaning that a couple no longer needed to formally prove specific wrongdoing by either party in order to legally separate. They could now simply and mutually decide, without assigning blame to either side, that the marriage genuinely wasn't working any longer. Divorce rates subsequently rose across much of the Western world, and marriage itself was fundamentally transformed from what had effectively functioned as a permanent lifelong sentence into a genuine personal commitment that could, if ultimately necessary, be formally and legally ended. It proved to be, all at once, genuinely liberating, often deeply painful, and thoroughly, unmistakably modern. the entirely natural consequence of a culture that now expected marriage to actively deliver genuine personal happiness. Trace the underlying logic carefully, and you'll recognize this development as having been almost historically inevitable, once the earlier cultural shift toward love-based marriage had fully taken hold. Once marriage became fundamentally understood as being primarily about romantic love and personal happiness, its entire underlying justification necessarily came to depend on actually delivering those two specific things to both partners involved. A marriage that had gradually become genuinely loveless or actively miserable no longer meaningfully served the core purpose that ordinary people now expected marriage to fulfill in the first place. If the entire underlying point of marriage was mutual affection and shared personal fulfillment, then a marriage providing neither of those things had, in a very real sense, already failed at its own core stated mission. The steadily rising cultural expectation of achieving a genuinely happy, loving marriage inevitably created, as its natural counterpart, a growing social acceptance that a genuinely unhappy marriage might reasonably deserve to be formally dissolved. For essentially the entire span of history we've covered throughout this account tonight, this simply wasn't a realistic option available to ordinary people. The established church doctrine of the indissoluble sacramental marital bond had effectively locked countless people into lifelong marriages, with only the narrow, genuinely expensive loophole of annulment available to a small privileged few with sufficient wealth and connections. Even after the Protestant Reformation had cracked that particular door open slightly, divorce generally remained difficult to obtain, heavily restricted by law, and frequently available only under genuinely grave, specifically defined circumstances, typically requiring formal legal proof that one particular spouse had committed some serious documented wrong against the other. Successfully ending a marriage remained, for most of subsequent history, a genuine ordeal of accumulated legal and social obstacles, entirely out of practical reach for a great many ordinary people, and carrying real social shame and stigma for nearly everyone who attempted it regardless of their underlying circumstances. The 20th century fundamentally transformed this entire legal landscape across much of the Western world. Over time, divorce laws in many different societies were substantially reformed and progressively liberalized, gradually making it genuinely possible for ordinary people to legally end marriages that had, in practice, already fundamentally broken down. The eventual culmination of this decades-long legal trend was the historic arrival of no-fault divorce, an authentically revolutionary legal development in its own right. Under a no-fault divorce system, a couple no longer needed to formally prove that one particular partner had committed some serious documented offense in order to legally justify ending the marriage. They could now simply divorce because the underlying marriage itself had genuinely failed, because they no longer wished to remain married, because the relationship, quite simply, wasn't working any longer for either party. Formal blame was no longer legally required. A mutual acknowledgement that the marriage had run its course proved legally sufficient on its own. The practical social effects of this legal shift were genuinely profound and relatively immediate. Divorce, which had once been comparatively rare and carried significant social scandal, became considerably more common across Western society and increasingly accepted as a normal, if often genuinely painful, part of ordinary adult life. People who found themselves trapped within genuinely miserable, loveless, or in some documented cases, outright dangerous marriages gained access, for the first time in generations, to a genuine practical path toward personal freedom that earlier generations could only ever have dreamed about. Marriage itself was fundamentally reconceived within Western culture, no longer an unbreakable lifetime sentence to be endured regardless of circumstances until death, but instead a genuine personal commitment that now carried within it the real practical possibility of an honorable, dignified ending when necessary. Of course, this significant transformation came with genuinely real costs and authentic personal pain attached to it, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise in any responsible historical account. Rising divorce rates across Western society brought real heartbreak, disrupted established families, genuine financial hardship for many, and often genuinely difficult consequences for the children and broader communities involved. Social critics at the time, and since, have raised legitimate concerns about the potential weakening of marriage as a foundational social institution, and about the broader social effects of increased family instability across society. These particular concerns were, and largely remain today, entirely serious and worth taking genuinely seriously, and this broader historical transformation certainly wasn't achieved without real, documented social costs and casualties along the way. But the underlying historical shift itself remains genuinely clear, and in retrospect, it appears entirely consistent with essentially everything else we've traced throughout this entire 5,000-year story tonight. A broader culture that had chosen to organize marriage fundamentally around romantic love inevitably had to become, sooner or later, a culture that also permitted divorce for the eventual loss of that same love. These two seemingly separate historical developments were, in reality, genuinely bound tightly together, two distinct sides of precisely the same underlying modern coin. Marriage had become, over the preceding 2 centuries, something people now freely chose to enter into for themselves, and increasingly, something they retain the practical freedom to eventually unmake as well, should circumstances genuinely require it. Which brings us, at long last, all the way to the present day, where marriage as an institution now looks so fundamentally different from where our story originally began that your most distant ancient ancestors would scarcely even recognize it as the same underlying custom. Part 30. Marriage Today, the End of a 5,000-Year Journey. And so here we finally arrive together at the genuinely strange and remarkable present moment. Marriage today looks almost nothing whatsoever like those original clay contracts carefully pressed by anonymous scribes in ancient Mesopotamia, all those thousands of years ago. Ordinary people now routinely meet potential partners through smartphone apps, marry primarily and explicitly for love, or in growing numbers, choose not to formally marry at all. Wedding celebrations can now easily cost more than an entire house. Married spouses are increasingly viewed and treated, by law and by broad cultural consensus, as genuinely equal partners. And across a great many places around the world today, the very legal definition of exactly who is permitted to marry has meaningfully expanded to include couples who were, for most of the history we've covered tonight, explicitly and legally forbidden from marrying at all. It represents, in a very real sense, the eventual culmination of a genuinely remarkable 5,000-year journey, traveling all the way from cold, calculated negotiation to warm, freely exercised personal choice. Marriage today is no longer something that primarily happens to a person, imposed from outside by family or church or state. It has become instead something a person actively decides for themselves, with their own whole, complicated heart, for deeply personal reasons that would have utterly baffled essentially every one of their historical ancestors we've discussed throughout this entire story. Consider, for a moment, how differently people now actually find each other, because this alone would genuinely astonish absolutely every preceding generation covered in this account. Where a professional matchmaker once carefully studied entire families and their respective fortunes, or where your realistic romantic options were once genuinely limited to the small handful of eligible people living within your own village. Today, a great many people instead meet through digital apps and websites that efficiently sort through truly vast numbers of potential partners on your behalf. In a genuinely curious sense, this represents the ancient figure of the matchmaker reborn as modern technology, an automated system now filtering candidates and algorithmically suggesting potential matches, except now, You personally scroll directly through the available options yourself, often at 2 in the morning, judging complete strangers based on a handful of photographs and a clever opening line. The underlying tools involved have become genuinely futuristic. The underlying human hope driving the whole exercise remains exactly as old as it has always been throughout this entire story. The fundamental reasons people choose to marry today have completed their genuinely long historical transformation. The bride price, the dowry, the calculated political alliance, the careful family strategy, essentially all of it has faded into historical memory for the overwhelming majority of people marrying today. The now overwhelming cultural expectation is that you marry primarily for love, for genuine companionship, for the deeply personal desire to build a shared life alongside someone you have freely and independently chosen for yourself. Your spouse is now expected to function as your genuine partner and equal in every meaningful sense. And the older historical idea of marrying someone specifically selected by your parents, purely for reasons of property or family alliance, now strikes most people living today as almost genuinely unimaginable. The long historical journey from binding contract to free personal choice is, for the most part, essentially complete. Marriage has also become, in a great many parts of the contemporary world, genuinely optional in a way it simply never was throughout most of recorded human history. For essentially the entirety of the history we've traced tonight, marriage represented a near-universal social necessity, genuinely essential for basic economic survival, for maintaining social respectability, and for securing any meaningful place within one's own community. Today, across many parts of the modern world, people can build full, socially respected lives entirely without ever marrying at all. They can live together as committed partners without formally marrying. They can raise children outside the bounds of formal marriage, or they can simply choose to remain single indefinitely, all without facing anything resembling the crushing social necessity that once made marriage effectively mandatory for virtually everyone. Marriage has genuinely shifted, within contemporary culture, from being a near-universal obligation everyone was firmly expected to fulfill, into becoming instead one legitimate life path among several that people today may freely and openly choose for themselves. The very legal definition of exactly who may marry has expanded, in recent decades, in ways that would have been genuinely unthinkable throughout most of the long story we've covered together tonight. Across a great many places around the contemporary world, the established legal boundaries surrounding marriage have meaningfully widened to include couples who were, for most of recorded history, explicitly forbidden from marrying one another at all, reflecting a broader, still evolving cultural understanding of marriage as fundamentally a union available to people based on their genuine love and personal commitment to one another, rather than on rigid traditional restrictions imposed from outside. It represents a continuation of the same long historical arc we've traced together throughout this entire account. Marriage steadily becoming more genuinely centered on the authentic bond shared between two people, and correspondingly less governed by external rules imposed from beyond that relationship. And yet, for all of this genuinely remarkable historical change, the wedding ceremony itself remains, even today, stubbornly and wonderfully elaborate. People today still routinely spend truly enormous sums of money on wedding celebrations. They still gather their entire surrounding community together specifically to formally witness their union. They still faithfully perform rituals whose original historical roots stretch back many thousands of years into our shared human past. The wedding ring still circles the finger, exactly as it has for millennia. The wedding feast still fills long tables with food and drink, exactly as it always has. The formal vows are still spoken aloud, before an assembled audience of loved ones, exactly as they were in countless earlier eras. Beneath all of this genuine modern transformation we've traced tonight, The deep ancient human instinct to properly mark this particular moment with meaningful ceremony and shared community endures, remarkably, almost entirely unchanged across the full span of this 5,000-year story. So here we finally are together at the natural end of a very long journey, one that genuinely began with two prehistoric people quietly deciding to share a single fire for warmth. And now, 5,000 years later, ends with modern couples swiping through apps, freely choosing, and openly committing their whole hearts to one another entirely by their own personal choice. Marriage across this entire span of human history has been at various points a binding legal contract, a sacred religious sacrament, a calculated political strategy, a genuine legal cage, and finally, in our own time, an authentic personal choice. Through fully 5,000 years of continuous transformation, one single underlying thing has never actually disappeared from the story: the deep, persistent human longing to find another person and to build some kind of shared life together with them, regardless of whatever particular rules a given historical age happened to impose on that basic universal longing. So there you have it, 5,000 years of marriage, condensed into a single long evening together, traveling all the way from ancient clay tablets and carefully negotiated bride prices, through political alliances and forbidden courtly love, through coverture and annulment and the quiet dismantling of old legal cages, all the way to modern dating apps and freely chosen love. Tonight, together, you've traveled through a history considerably stranger, and often considerably harsher than any fairy tale you were told as a child. You've been quietly bartered for livestock. You've been formally promised to complete strangers before you could even walk on your own. You've been married off specifically to seal political alliances you yourself never had any say in choosing. You've watched your own independent legal identity quietly vanish the very moment you finished speaking your wedding vows. You've endured a wedding night with a considerably larger audience than anyone would reasonably want. And you've pined, through centuries of poetry, for a form of love that marriage itself, for most of this story, simply wasn't ever designed to include in the first place. You've been, across this long story, a legal contract, a sacred religious sacrament, a calculated political strategy, and a valuable bargaining chip. All of this happening long before anyone ever seriously thought to ask what your own heart genuinely wanted for itself. And through absolutely all of it, ordinary people somehow found their way through to the other side. They endured arrangements they never personally chose, and rules they had genuinely no power to change on their own. And still, somehow, against considerable odds, they consistently found real tenderness in the surviving cracks of these rigid systems. They gradually grew to love the strangers who had originally been assigned to them by others. They laughed at their own weddings. They wept through their own genuine losses. And they quietly passed down, generation after generation, the stubborn, persistent hope that real partnership might make an otherwise hard life feel just a little bit softer to bear. Whatever any particular age genuinely demanded of them, they kept reaching for authentic human connection anyway, against whatever odds they happened to face. So tonight, as you drift gradually off to sleep, whether beside the particular person you yourself freely chose, or peacefully alone within a life that belongs entirely and completely to you, perhaps spare one quiet, unhurried thought for all of the countless couples who came long before you in this story. The ones who genuinely never got to choose for themselves. The ones who simply signed the contract they were handed, paid whatever price was demanded of them, and quietly built some kind of meaningful life out of whatever circumstances they happened to be given by their own particular era. Because the basic freedom to marry purely for love, or to freely choose not to marry at all, was fully 5,000 years in the patient making, built up slowly and quietly, piece by piece, by countless generations of people who, in the overwhelming majority of cases, never personally got to fully enjoy that particular freedom themselves. History, as we've seen together tonight, is frequently messy, often genuinely unfair, and sometimes even quietly absurd when examined closely. But it also stands, across this entire 5,000-year span, as genuine proof that the human heart keeps stubbornly insisting on love, one determined generation after another, regardless of whatever obstacles happen to stand in its way. Sleep well.